The Bible is the product of minds that were exposed to and influenced by and reacting to the ideas and cultures of their day. And as I suggested in the opening lecture, comparative study of the literature of the ancient Near East and the Bible reveals the shared cultural and literary heritage at the same time that it reveals great differences between the two. In the literature of the Bible, some members of Israelite society, probably a cultural, religious, and literary elite, broke radically with the prevailing norms of the day. They mounted a critique of prevailing norms. The persons responsible for the final editing and shaping of the Bible, somewhere from the 7th to the 5th or 4th century BCE, right? We're not totally sure, and we'll talk more about that. But those final editors were members of this group, and they had a specific worldview, and they imposed that worldview on the older traditions and stories that are found in the Bible. That radical new worldview in the Bible was monotheism. But why, you might ask, should the idea of one God instead of many be so radical? What is so different? What's different about having a one God from having a pantheon of gods headed by a superior God? What is so new and revolutionary about monotheism? Well, according to one school of thought, there isn't anything particularly revolutionary about monotheism. And the classical account of the rise of monotheism that has prevailed for a very long time runs as follows, and I have a little flow chart here to illustrate it for you. The argument goes that in every society, there's a natural progression from polytheism, which is the belief in many gods. Usually these are personifications of natural forces, to henotheism, heno, one God, or monolatry, which is really the worship of one God as supreme over other gods. So not denying the existence of the other gods, ascribing reality to them, but isolating one as the supreme God, and on to monotheism, where essentially one believes only in the reality of one God. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, this progression was viewed as an advance, which is not very surprising because the whole theory was put forward by scholars who were basically Western monotheists. And these scholars maintained that certain elements of biblical religion represented pure religion. Religion evolved to its highest form, no longer tainted by pagan and polytheistic elements of Canaanite religion generally. So applying an evolutionary model to religion carried with it a very clear value judgment. Polytheism was understood as clearly inferior and primitive. Monolatry was an improvement, right? It was getting better, it was getting closer, but monotheism was judged to be the best and purest form of religion. Well, this view, this evolutionary view or evolutionary model, was challenged by a man named Yechezkel Kaufman in the 1930s. And Kaufman argued that monotheism does not and cannot evolve from polytheism because the two are based on radically divergent worldviews, radically divergent intuitions about reality. And in a multi-volume work, which was later translated and abridged, and you've got a selection of reading from the translated abridgment, so it's translated by Moshe Greenberg, an abridged version of his massive work, The Religion of Israel. Kaufman asserted that the monotheism of Israel couldn't be the natural outgrowth of the polytheism of an earlier age. It was a radical break with it. It was a total cultural and religious discontinuity. It was a polemic against polytheism and the pagan worldview. That's implicit, he says, throughout the biblical text. It's been said that Kaufman replaces the evolutionary model with a revolutionary model. This was a revolution, not an evolution. Now, one advantage of Kaufman's model is that we avoid some of this pejorative, we can avoid some of the pejorative evaluations of polytheism as primitive, right, as necessarily earlier and primitive and inferior. They're simply positing the existence of two distinct orientations, two divergent worldviews. They each have their explanatory merits, and they each have their specific problems and difficulties. It's not to say that Kaufman wasn't clearly judgmental, but at least the potential is there for us to understand these as two distinct systems, each, again, as I say, with its explanatory merits. But as we'll see, some of the things that monotheism solves only invite other sorts of problems that it has to wrestle with throughout its long life. Now, in Kaufman's view, the similarities, therefore, between the Israelites and ancient Near Eastern religion and cultures that everyone was so busily finding and celebrating, these were, in the end, similarities in form and external structure, appearance. They weren't essential similarities. They differed in content. Sure, they both have animal sacrifice. Sure, they both have ritual purity laws. Sure, they share certain stories and legends. But these have been adopted by the Israelites and transformed into vehicles that convey the basic ideas of the monotheistic worldview. So a similarity in form doesn't mean a similarity in function, and in this, Kaufman's anticipating arguments made by anthropologists. The ritual cult of the Israelites may look like that of their neighbors, but it functioned very differently. Its purpose was drastically different from that of Israel's neighbors. The Israelites, like their neighbors, may have set up a king over themselves, but Israelite monarchy differed from Canaanite monarchy in significant ways because of their monotheism. These are all things we will test and explore. So the meaning and function of Israel's cult, of Israel's king, of its creation stories, or any of its other narratives, they derive from the place of those items within the larger cultural framework or worldview of Israel, and that larger framework or worldview is one of basic monotheism. So let's turn then to Kaufman's description of the fundamental distinction between the polytheistic worldview and the revolutionary monotheistic worldview that took root in Israel. And I am going to be rehearsing and then critiquing the arguments that are in that 100-page reading that I assigned for you this week. This is the only time something like this will happen in the course. And I do that because these ideas are so fundamental, and we are going to be wrestling with them throughout the course. So it's important to me that you absorb this stuff right from the beginning and think about it and be critical of it and engage it. Kaufman's ideas are very important. They're also overstated in some ways, and that's why we're going to be wrestling with some of these ideas throughout the course. So let's begin with Kaufman's characterization of what he calls pagan religion, right? That's the term that he uses. The fundamental idea of pagan religion, he says, and I quote, "The idea that there exists a realm of being prior to the gods and above them, upon which they depend and whose decrees even they must obey." The meta-divine realm. This is the realm of supreme and ultimate power, and it transcends the deities. All right? The deity or the deities emerge from and are therefore subject to the laws of the meta-divine realm, the forces and powers of the meta-divine realm. And the nature of this realm will vary from pagan tradition to pagan tradition. It might be water, it might be darkness, it might be spirit, or in ancient Greek religion, a more sort of philosophical polytheism, it might be fate. Even the gods are subject to the decrees of fate. They have no control over that. Kaufman asserts, therefore, this belief, once you posit a primordial realm, some realm that is beside or beyond the gods, that's independent of them and primary, you have automatically limited the gods. So what I've done is I've spelled out here for you consequences, logical consequences of positing a meta-divine realm. You know, once you have a meta-divine realm, all of these things are going to follow. The gods are going to be limited. All right? They are not the source of all. They are bound by, they're subservient to this meta-divine realm. There can therefore be no notion of a supreme divine will, an absolute or sovereign divine will. The will of any one God ultimately can be countered by the decrees of the primordial realm, and the will of all the gods can be thwarted by the decrees of the primordial realm. The will of any one God can be thwarted by perhaps another God. All right? So the gods are limited in power. They're also limited in their wisdom. Right? That falls under this as well. They're not going to be all-knowing or all-wise because of the existence of this realm that's beyond them, and which is in many ways mysterious to them as well. It's unpredictable to them too. It's not in their control or in their power. Individual gods might be very wise. They might be wise in particular crafts. They might be a god of healing, very, very wise in healing, or a god of some other craft or area of knowledge, but they possess wisdom as an attribute, not as an essential characteristic. Kaufmann asserts that mythology is basic to pagan religions. Mythologies are the lives or tales of the lives of gods, tales of the lives of the gods. In pagan religions, the gods are born, and they live lives very similar to human lives, but on a grand scale, and then they die. They might be reborn too. Pagan religions contain theogonies, the birth of a god, theogony, accounts of the births of gods. Now, this impersonal primordial realm, Kaufmann declares, contains the seeds of all beings. Very often in these creation stories, there is some sense of some realm from which life begins to emerge, usually beginning with gods. So these cosmogonies and theogonies will describe the generation of sexually differentiated divine beings, also the generation of the natural world, also the generation of human beings and animals. In other words, this is the primordial womb for all that is, divine, human, and natural. It is the source of everything mundane and divine. What that means, Kaufmann asserts, is that in pagan religion there's very often a fluid boundary between the divine, the human, and the natural worlds. They blur into one another because they all emerge ultimately from this same primordial world stuff. Right? The distinctions between them are soft. We see this in the fact that gods are very often associated with natural powerful forces. Right? The sky is a god. The fire is a god. Fertility, a natural process, is a god. So there's no real distinction between the worship of gods and the worship of nature. Second, he says, because humans also emerge ultimately from this primordial realm, there's a confusion of the boundary between the divine and the human. That's common, he says. He chooses the word confusion. That's common in pagan religion. And so we often have in pagan religions unions between divine beings and human beings. Kaufmann argues, and I quote, that the continuity between the divine and human realm is at the basis of the pagan belief in apotheosis, humans becoming gods, perhaps after death, for example, becoming immortal, or very often kings, when they ascend to the throne, become gods. Whatever power the gods have, Kaufmann says, is not due to the fact that their will is absolute or their spirit is absolute. The realm that transcends the gods, this meta-divine realm, is that which has ultimate power. And the stuff of which it is made is what has ultimate power. So power is materially conceived. It inheres in certain things, in certain substances, particularly substances or materials that are deeply connected to whatever this primordial world stuff is. So if it's blood, then blood that courses through the veins of living creatures is seen to have some deep and powerful connection with the meta-divine realm, and that is where power resides. If it is water, then water will be viewed as particularly materially powerful in that particular system. So gods have power only insofar as they are connected with that primordial world stuff, a technical term that I used throughout this lecture. That means that magic is possible in such a system. Because power is materially conceived, in other words, since it is believed to inhere in certain natural substances that resemble or are connected to the primordial world stuff, that's the source of all power, then magic is possible by manipulating those material substances in certain ways. It might be clay, it might be water, it might be blood. Then whatever is believed to hold the power of this primordial life force, humans can tap into and influence the activities of the meta-divine realm. So through manipulation, magical manipulations of certain substances, they can harness, Kaufmann says, they can harness these forces, these independent self-operating forces. And so the human magician is really a technician, and he can make these forces come to bear on even the gods, to coerce the gods to do his will, and so on. So magic in a pagan system, Kaufmann claims, is a way of getting around the gods, circumventing the capricious will of the gods and demons. Because magic is directed at the meta-divine realm, trying to tap into its powers. It's not directed at the gods. It's trying to tap into the ultimate source of power, to use that power to influence the gods in a particular way or protect oneself against the gods. Similarly, divination. Divination is an attempt to discern the future that's once again heads right to the source of power. It's not directed at the gods, unless you're hoping to use them as a medium through which to get access to the meta-divine realm. But ultimately, most divination is aimed at untapping the secrets of the meta-divine realm and not the gods. Discerning the will of the gods is really of little use, right? Because even their will can be thwarted or overthrown by other gods or by the decrees of the meta-divine realm. The pagan cult, Kaufmann claims, is a system of rites. I use the word cult, and every year people look at me and say, you know, what is cult? I don't even understand what that means. We'll learn more about cult. But it refers to a system of rites. Okay, a system of rites, and we'll be looking at the Israelite cult later. So the pagan cult, he says, is a system of rites that involves the manipulation of substances, again, blood, animal flesh, human flesh, precious metals, and so on, that are believed to have some kind of inherent power, again, because of their connection to whatever the primordial world stuff may be in that tradition. So according to Kaufmann, there's always an element of magic in the pagan cult. It's seeking through these rituals and manipulations of certain substances to, again, let loose certain powers, set into motion certain forces that will coerce a god to be propitiated, for example, or calmed, or to act favorably, or to vindicate the devotees, and so on. Some of these cultic acts might be defensive or protective, so that the god cannot harm the worshiper. Many of the cultic festivals are keyed into mythology, the stories of the lives of the gods. Many of the cultic festivals will be reenactments of events in the life of the god. A battle that the god had, the death of the god. Usually in the winter, cultic rituals will reenact the death of the god, and then in spring, the rising or resurrection of the god. These are all reenactment festivals that occur very often, and it's believed that by reenacting these festivals in this cultic way, one brings magical powers into play and can in fact ensure and maintain the reemergence of life in the spring. And so it's essential for the maintenance, preservation of the world. One final and very important point, and we're going to wrestle with this quite a bit during the year. Kaufmann claims, again, in the polytheistic worldview, the primordial realm contains the seeds of all being. Everything is generated from that realm, good and bad. So just as there are good gods who might protect human beings, there are also evil gods who seek to destroy both humans and other gods. Death and disease are consigned to the realm of these evil demons or these impure evil spirits, but they are siblings with the good gods. Human beings are basically powerless, he says, in the continual cosmic struggle between the good gods and the evil demons, unless they can utilize magic, divination, tap into the powers of the meta-divine realm, circumvent the gods who might be making their lives rather miserable. But what's important is that Kaufmann insists that in the pagan view, evil is an autonomous demonic realm. It is as primary and real as the realm of the holy or good gods. Evil is a metaphysical reality. It is built into the structure of the universe. That's the way the universe was made. The primordial stuff that spawned all that is, spawned it good and bad and exactly as it is, and it's there and it's real. Salvation, he says, is the concern of humans. The gods aren't interested in human salvation. They're from the capricious forces and powers in the world because they're trying to save themselves. You know, the good gods are being attacked by the evil gods. The powers and decrees of the meta-divine realm are hassling them as well as anybody else. So they can't be worried about humans. They're worried about themselves. Salvation is attained through magic or Gnostic means. Gnosticism refers to knowledge of secrets that can in some way liberate one from the regular rules. And so as long as one can somehow circumvent the god, gods tie oneself into the powers of the meta-divine realm to be beyond the reach of the demons and the capricious gods who make life on earth a misery. That is the path for salvation. So Kaufman says that the pagan worldview is one of an amoral universe. It's somewhere around here. There we go, amoral universe. Not a moral universe, not an immoral universe, but an amoral universe. It is morally neutral. There are gods who are legislators and guardians of social order and justice, but their laws aren't absolute. They can be leveled by the decrees of the supreme meta-divine realm. And since the knowledge and wisdom of each god is limited, morality can be defined as what a particular god likes or desires, and that may be different from what another god likes or desires, and there's no absolute morality then. And it's that picture of the universe, Kaufman wants to argue, that is challenged by the monotheistic revolution. Again, right, he sees this as a revolution of ancient Israel. So according to Kaufman, the fundamental idea of ancient Israelite writing, which receives no systematic formulation but permeates the entire Bible, in his view, is a radically new idea of a God who is himself the source of all being, not subject to a meta-divine realm. There's no transcendent cosmic order or power. He does not emerge from some pre-existing realm, and therefore he is free of all of the limitations of myth and magic. We'll go through these one by one, but a God whose will is absolute and sovereign. All right? So what then are the implications of the elimination of this meta-divine realm? All right, there, just as these points flowed logically from positing a meta-divine realm, what flows logically from eliminating a meta-divine realm and positing simply a God that does not emerge from any pre-existing power or order or realm? Well, first of all, there's no theogony or mythology in the Bible. God isn't born from some primordial womb. He doesn't have a life story. There's no realm that is primary to him or prior to him, and there is no realm that is the source of his power and wisdom. So in the opening chapters of Genesis, God simply is. He doesn't grow, he doesn't age, he doesn't mature, he doesn't have in the Bible a female consort. God doesn't die. So in the Hebrew Bible, Kaufman claims, for the first time in history, we meet an unlimited God who's timeless and ageless and non-physical and eternal. That means that this God transcends nature, which means we're going to get rid of number 3 as well, right? As the sovereign of all realms, God isn't by nature bound to any particular realm. He's not identifiable as a force of nature or identified with a force of nature. Nature certainly becomes the stage of God's expression of his will. He expresses his will and purpose through forces of nature in the Bible, but nature isn't God himself. He's not identified. He's wholly other. He isn't kin to humans in any way either. So there is no blurring, no soft boundary between humans and the divine, according to Kaufman, in the Bible. There's no apotheosis in the Bible, no life after death in the Bible either. Did you know that? Have to wait a few centuries for that idea to come along, but certainly not in the Hebrew Bible. People live 70 years and that's it. So there's no process by which humans become gods, and certainly no process in the reverse as well. Magic in the Hebrew Bible is represented as useless. It's pointless. There's no meta-divine realm to tap into. Power doesn't adhere in any stuff in the natural world. So the world is sort of de-divinized, right? Demythologized. Power isn't understood as a material thing or something that adheres in material substances. God can't be manipulated or coerced by charms or words or rituals. They have no power and cannot be used in that way. And so magic is sin. Magic is sin or rebellion against God because it's predicated on a whole mistaken notion of God having limited power. There are magical conceptions throughout the Bible. You're going to run into them. But interestingly enough, the editors of the stories in which they appear will very often hammer home the conclusion that actually what happened because God willed it to happen. The event occurred because God wanted it to occur. It didn't occur independently of his will or by virtue of some power that's inherent in the magician's artifices. So Kaufman argues that magic in the Bible is recast as a witness to God's sovereignty, God's power. And they're stripped, magical actions are stripped of their autonomous potency. Again, they're serving as vehicles then for the manifestation of the will of God. Divination is also unassimilable to the monotheistic idea, according to Kaufman, because it also presupposes the existence of some meta-divine realm, some source of power, knowledge, or information that transcends God. And again, it's an attempt to reveal God's secrets in an ungodly way, predicated on a mistake. It is permitted to make inquiries of God through oracular devices, but God only conveys information at his own will. There's no ritual or incantation, Kaufman says, or material substance that can coerce a revelation from God. So we will see things that look like magic and divination and oracles and dreams and prophecy in the pagan world and in ancient Israel. But Kaufman says the similarity is a similarity in form only, and it's a superficial, formal, external similarity. Each of these phenomena, he says, is transformed by the basic Israelite idea of one supreme transcendent God, whose will is absolute, and all of these things relate to the direct word and will of God. They aren't recourse to a separate science or lore or body of knowledge or interpretive craft that calls upon forces or powers that transcend God or are independent of God. By the same token, the cult, Kaufman says, has no automatic or material power. It's not just sort of a place where certain kinds of magical coercive acts happen. The cult isn't designed to service the material needs of God either. It doesn't affect his life and vitality. By enacting certain rituals, you don't ensure that God doesn't die, and so on. No events in God's life are celebrated, right? The festivals that are carried out in the cultic context. So the mythological rationales for cult that you find amongst Israel's neighbors are replaced, and they're replaced very often by historical rationales. This action is done to commemorate such and such event in the history of the nation. So pagan festivals in Israel, Kaufman says, are historicized, commemorating events in the life of the people and not in the story of the God's life, since we have no mythology. So, but we are going to be spending a fair amount of time talking actually about the meaning and the function of Israel's purity laws and cultic laws in a later lecture. Now, since God is himself the transcendent source of all being, and since he is good, in a monotheistic system, there are no evil agents that constitute a realm that opposes God as an equal rival. No divine evil agents. Again, in the pagan worldview, the primordial womb spawns all sorts of beings, all kinds of divinities, good and evil, that are in equal strength. They're sort of locked in this cosmic struggle. But in the Israelite worldview, if God is the source of all being, then there can't be a realm of supernatural beings that do battle with him. There's no room for a divine antagonist of the one supreme God, which is leading us down here to this point, that sin and evil are demythologized in the Hebrew Bible. And that's very interesting. It's going to lead to a lot of interesting things. It's also going to create a really huge problem for monotheistic thought that they're going to struggle with for centuries, and actually still do struggle with today. But again, in the pagan worldview, sin is understood very often as the work of a demon or an evil god that might possess a person, might have to be exorcised from that person by means of magic. You know, if you tap into some of these substances and you can use the powers in those substances to coerce the demon to be expelled from the person's body. These are things that are very common in polytheistic and pagan practices. But in Israel, we have no meta-divine realm to spawn these evil beings, these various gods. So Israelite religion did not conceive of sin as caused by an independent evil power that exists out there in the universe and is defying the will of God. Instead, evil comes about as a result of the clash of the will of God and the will of humans who happen to have the freedom to rebel. There's nothing inherently supernatural about sin. It's not a force or a power built into the universe. Kaufman is claiming, therefore, that in Israel, evil is transferred from the metaphysical realm, built into the physical structure of the universe, to the moral realm. I've put it up here for you. Evil is a moral and not a metaphysical reality. It doesn't have a concrete, independent existence. And that means that human beings, and only human beings, are the potential source of evil in the world. Responsibility for evil lies in the hands of human beings. In the Hebrew Bible, no one will ever say, the devil made me do it. There is no devil in the Hebrew Bible. That's also the invention of a much later age. And that is an important and critical ethical revolution. Evil is a moral and not a metaphysical reality. You had what second millennium Hebrews and early first millennium Israelites or Judahites actually believed or did is not always retrievable. In fact, probably not retrievable to us. We have some clues. But in all likelihood, Hebrews of an older time, the patriarchal period, the second millennium BCE, they probably weren't markedly different from many of their polytheistic neighbors. Archaeology would suggest that in some ways that's true. We do find evidence in the Bible, as well as in the archaeological record, of popular practices that are not strictly monotheistic. The worship of little household idols, right? Local fertility deities, for example. Most scholars conjecture that ancient Israelite Judean religion, the practices of the people in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the first millennium BCE, it was maybe monolatrous. They might have promoted the worship of one God, Yahweh, without denying the existence of other gods, and still kept their little idols and fertility gods, or engaged in various syncretistic practices. It was probably monolatrist rather than monotheistic, really asserting the reality of only one God. Moreover, our evidence suggests that Yahweh was in many respects very similar to many of the gods of Canaanite religion. And we'll be talking about some of those at the appropriate time, but continuities with Canaanite and ancient Near Eastern religions are apparent in the worship practices and the cult objects of ancient Israel and Judah, as they're described in the biblical stories and as we find them in archaeological discoveries. The Hebrew Bible also contains sources that exhibit features of what Kaufman has described as contemporary polytheisms. In Genesis 6, I mean, the text you pointed out is a good one, but even better, go look at Genesis 6, where you have these Nephilim, these divine beings who descend to earth and they mate with female humans. That's a real fluid boundary between the divine and human realms, if you ask me. But it only happens there in one spot. In many passages, too, Yahweh is represented as presiding over a council of gods. Right? Certainly in the Psalms, we have these sort of poetic and metaphoric descriptions where God is, okay, guys, what do you think? You know, providing, or he's one of them, actually. In one psalm, it's great. He's one of the gods, and he says, you know, you guys don't know what you're doing. Let me take over. And he stands up in the council and takes over. So there are other passages in the Bible, too, that assume the existence of gods, other gods worshipped by other nations. So there's certainly stuff like that in there you're going to have to think about. Now, nevertheless, the most strongly monotheistic sources of the Bible do posit a God that is qualitatively different from the gods that populated the mythology of Israel's neighbors and probably also Israelite Judean religion. In these sources, Israelite's deity is clearly the source of all being. He doesn't emerge from a pre-existing realm. He has no divine siblings. His will is absolute. His will is sovereign. He's not affected by magic or coercion. And biblical monotheism, biblical religion, assumes that this God is inherently good. He's just, he's compassionate, and human morality is conformity to his will. Because certain texts of the Bible posit this absolutely good God who places absolute moral demands on humankind, biblical monotheism is often referred to as ethical monotheism. So it's a term that you'll see quite a bit. Ethical monotheism. Beginning perhaps as early as the 8th century and continuing for several centuries, literate and decidedly monotheistic circles within Israelite society put a monotheistic framework on the ancient stories and traditions of the nation. They molded them into a foundation myth that would shape Israelite and Jewish self-identity and understanding in a profound way. They projected their monotheism onto an earlier time, onto the nation's most ancient ancestors. Israelite monotheism is represented in the Bible as beginning with Abraham. Historically speaking, It most likely began much later, and probably as a minority movement that grew to prominence over centuries. But that later monotheism is projected back over Israel's history by the final editors of the Bible. And that creates the impression of the biblical religion that Kaufman describes so well. All right? But the biblical text itself, the biblical record, is very conflicted. And that's part of the fun of reading it. And you will see the biblical record pointing to two different and conflicting realities. You will find religious practices and views that aren't strictly monotheistic. And you'll find later religious practices and views that are. And the later sources, which we might best call biblical religion, are breaking, therefore, not only with ancient Near Eastern practices, but also with Israelite Judean practices, with other elements within their own society. So biblical religion, as Kaufman describes it, isn't, I think, just a revolution of Israel against the nations. I think it's also a civil war of Israel against itself. And that's an aspect that is really not entertained by Kaufman. And I think it's an important one for us to entertain so that we can allow the biblical text to speak to us in all of its polyphony and not try to force it all into one model. Let's look a little bit more closely at Genesis 1 to make this case. The chapter begins with a temporal clause, which is unfortunately often translated in the beginning, which implies that what follows is going to give you an ultimate account of the origins of the universe. You sort of expect something like, in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. Like this was the first thing to happen in time, right? So that translation causes people to believe that the story is giving me an account of the first event in time, forward. But it's actually a bad translation. The Hebrew phrase that starts the book of Genesis is pretty much exactly like the phrase that starts Enuma Elish. When on high, there was a whole bunch of water and stuff, then suddenly this happened. Very similar in the Hebrew. It's better translated this way. When God began creating the heavens and the earth, he said, let there be light, and there was light. And that translation suggests that the story isn't concerned to depict the ultimate origins of the universe. It's interested in explaining how and why the world got the way it is. When God began this process of creating the heaven and the earth was unformed and void, and his wind was on the surface of the deep and so on, he said, let there be light, and there was light. So we find that, in fact, something exists. It has no shape. So creation in Genesis 1 is not described as a process of making something out of nothing. That's a notion referred to as creation ex nihilo, creation of something out of utter nothing. It's instead a process of organizing pre-existing materials and imposing order on those chaotic materials. So we begin with this chaotic mass, and then there's the ruach of God. Now sometimes this word ruach is kind of anachronistically translated as spirit. It really doesn't mean that in the Hebrew Bible. In later levels of Hebrew, it will start to mean that. But it is really wind. Ruach is wind. So when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, the wind of God sweeping over the deep. Remember the cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk, the storm god, who released his wind against Tiamat, the primeval deep, the primeval water, representing the forces of chaos. And you should immediately hear the great similarities. Our story opens with a temporal clause, when on high, when God began creating. We have a wind that sweeps over chaotic waters, just like the wind of Marduk released into the face of Tiamat. And the Hebrew term is particularly fascinating. In fact, the text says, and there is darkness on the face of deep. No definite article. The word deep is a proper name, perhaps. The Hebrew word is tahom, means deep. And etymologically, it's exactly the same word as tiamat. The at ending is just feminine. So tiam, tahom, it's the same word. It's a related word. So the wind over the face of deep. Now this demythologized. So it's as if they're invoking the story that would have been familiar and yet changing it. So the storyteller has actually set the stage for retelling the cosmic battle story that everyone knew. That was a story that surely was near and dear to the hearts of many ancient Israelites and ancient Near Eastern listeners. So all the elements are there for the retelling of that story. We've got wind, we've got a primeval, chaotic, watery mass or deep. And then, surprise, there's no battle. There's just a word. Let there be light. And the ancient Near Eastern listener would prick up their ears. Where's the battle? Where's the violence? Where's the gore? I thought I knew this story. So something new, something different was being communicated in this story. And don't think that biblical writers didn't know this motif of creation following upon a huge cosmic battle, particularly a battle with a watery dragon-like monster. There are many poetic passages in poetic sections of the Bible that contain very clear and explicit allusions to that myth. It was certainly known and told to Israelite children and part of the culture. We have it mentioned in Job. We have it mentioned in the following Psalm, Psalm 74, verses 12 to 17. O God, my King from of old, who brings deliverance throughout the land, it was you who drove back the sea with your might, who smashed the heads of the monsters in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan, a sea monster. Other Psalms also contain similar lines. Isaiah 51, verses 9 through 10. It was you that hacked Rahab, this is another name of a primeval water monster, in pieces. It was you that pierced the dragon. It was you that dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep. These were familiar stories. They were known in Israel. They were recounted in Israel. They were stories of a God who violently slays the forces of chaos, represented as watery dragons, as a prelude to creation. And the rejection of this motif or this idea in Genesis 1 is pointed and purposeful. It's demythologization. Its removal of the creation account from the realm and the world of mythology is pointed and purposeful. It wants us to conceive of God as an uncontested God who, through the power of his word or will, creates the cosmos. And he follows that initial ordering by setting up celestial bodies, just as Marduk did. They're not in themselves, however, divinities. They are merely God's creations. In the biblical text, the firmament appears to be a beaten, the word in Hebrew is something that's been beaten out, like a metal worker would hammer out a thin sheet of metal. And that's what the firmament is. This, by the way, is the portrait of the world. It looks a lot like my map of the ancient Near East, but it's not. So you have this firmament, which is beaten back to hold back primeval waters that are pressing in. You have land, which is holding down the waters here. We inhabit the bubble that's created in that way. That's the image in Enuma Elish, and it's the image of Genesis 1. And later on, when God gets mad, he's going to open up some windows up here, right? And it's all going to, the flood. That's what's going to happen in the flood. That's the image of the world that you're working with. So the firmament is sort of like an inverted bowl, a beaten out sheet of metal that's an inverted bowl. And again, as I said, echoes of Enuma Elish, where you have Marduk dividing the carcass of Tiamat like a shellfish. He separates the waters above and the waters below and creates this space that will become the inhabited world. Okay? Now, the story of creation in Genesis 1 takes place over 7 days, and there's a certain logic and parallelism to the 6 days of creating. And I've written those parallels here. There's a parallel between day 1, day 4, day 2 and 5, day 3 and 6. On day 1, light and dark are separated. On day 4, the heavenly bodies that give off light by day or night are created. On day 2, the firmament is established. That water is separated, that bubble is opened up. So we've got sky created, and we've got the waters collected in certain areas down here, right? Water down here, and we've got sky. On day 5, the inhabitants of the skies and the waters are created, birds and fish. On day 3, land is formed to make dry spots from the waters below. So you have land being formed on day 3, it's separated out from the sea. And on day 6, you have the creation of land animals. But days 3 and 6 each have an extra element. And the fact that the first elements here pair up nicely with each other suggests that the extra element on day 3 and the extra element on day 6 might also be paired in some important way. On day 3, vegetation is created, and on day 6, humans are created after the creation of the land animals. So the implication is that the vegetation is for the humans. And indeed, it's expressly stated by God that humans are to be given every fruit-bearing tree and seed-bearing plant, fruits and grains, for food. That's in Genesis 1:29. That's what you are going to eat. There's no mention of chicken or beef. There's no mention made of animals for food. In Genesis 1 verse 30, God says that the animals are being given the green plants, the grass and herbs, for food. In other words, there should be no competition for food. Humans have fruit and grain-bearing vegetation. Animals have the herbage and the grasses. There is no excuse to live in anything but a peaceful coexistence. Therefore, humans, according to Genesis 1, were created vegetarian. And in every respect, the original creation is imagined as free of bloodshed and violence of every kind. And God saw that it was very good. So on the seventh day, God rested from his labors, and for this reason, he blessed the seventh day and declared it holy. This is a word we'll be coming back to in about 5 or 6 lectures, talking about what it is to be holy. But right now, it essentially means it belongs to God. If something's holy, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to God. Okay? And part of the purpose of this story is to explain the origin of the observance of the Sabbath. The seventh day is a holy day. So this is a myth in that sense that it's explaining some custom or ritual among the people. So Israelite accounts of creation contain clear allusions to and resonances of ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies, but perhaps Genesis 1 can best be described as demythologizing what was a common cultural heritage. There's a clear tendency in this story towards monotheism in the abstract terms that Kaufman described, a transformation of widely known stories to express a monotheistic worldview was clearly important to these particular biblical writers, and we'll be talking later about who these writers were who wrote Genesis 1 as opposed to Genesis 2 and 3. But these stories rival and implicitly polemicize against the myths or mythologies of Israel's neighbors. They reject certain elements, but they almost reject them by incorporating them, right? They incorporate and modify them. So one of the things I've tried to claim in describing Genesis 1 is that in this story, evil is represented not as a physical reality. It's not built into the structure of the world. Right? When God rests, he's looking at the whole thing. It's very good. It's set up very well. And yet we know that evil is a condition of human existence. It's a reality of life. So how do we account for it? And the Garden of Eden story, I think, seeks to answer that question. It actually does a whole bunch of things. But one thing it does, I think, is try to answer that question and to assert that evil stems from human behavior. God created a good world. But humans, in the exercise of their moral autonomy, they have the power to corrupt the good. So the Garden of Eden story communicates what Kaufman would identify as a basic idea of a monotheistic worldview, that evil isn't a metaphysical reality, it's a moral reality. What that means ultimately is that evil lacks inevitability, depending on your theory of human nature, I suppose. But it also means that evil lies within the realm of human responsibility and control. Now, Nahum Sarna, the scholar whose work I referred to earlier, he points out that there's a very important distinction between the Garden of Eden story and its ancient Near Eastern parallels. He says the motif of a tree of life or a plant of life or a plant of eternal youth, that's a motif that we do find in other ancient Near Eastern literatures, in ancient Near Eastern myth and ritual and iconography. And the quest for such a plant, or the quest for immortality, that the plant promises, that these were primary themes in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. We'll have occasion to talk in great depth about this story next time. But by contrast, Sarna says, we haven't as yet uncovered a parallel in ancient Near Eastern literature to the biblical tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of knowledge. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's a longer phrase. What is the significance of the fact that the Bible mentions both of these trees? It mentions a tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then goes on to just focus on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It virtually ignores the tree of life until we get to the end of the story, and that's important. But this tree of life, which seems to be central to many other myths of this time and this part of the world, Sarna argues that the subordinate role of the tree of life signals the biblical writer's dissociation from a preoccupation with immortality. The biblical writer insists that the central concern of life is not mortality, but morality. And the drama of human life should revolve not around the search for eternal life, but around the moral conflict and tension between a good God's design for creation and the free will of human beings that can corrupt that good design. The serpent tells Eve that if she eats the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she will become like God. And he's really not telling a lie in a certain respect. And God knows that. The human beings will become like gods, knowing good and evil. It's one of the things about God. Knows good and evil and has chosen the good. Right? The biblical writer asserts of this God that he is absolutely good. The humans will become like gods, knowing good and evil, not because of some magical property in this fruit. And it's not an apple, by the way. That's based on an interesting mistranslation. Do we know what the fruit is? Nobody, I don't think we really know. But it's definitely not an apple. That comes from the Latin word, which sounds like apple. The word malum for evil is close to the Latin word for apple, which if anybody knows, whatever. And so in the history, our iconography began to represent this tree as an apple tree and so on. But it's not an apple tree. I don't know if they had apple trees back then there. But it's not because of some magical property in the fruit itself, but because of the action of disobedience itself. By choosing to eat of the fruit in defiance of God, right? This is the one thing God says, don't do this. You can have everything else in this garden. Presumably, even you can eat of the tree of life, right? Doesn't say you can't eat of that. Who's to say they couldn't eat of that and just live forever? Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Is there any sort of explanation for why God says you can't eat of this tree when he's given all of the fruit-bearing trees?
There have been about how many thousands of years of speculation on what's going on, and you're going to be reading a wonderful and interesting Gnostic interpretation. There's been lots of interesting, and this is all in the realm of literary interpretation. Read the story closely. See if you can figure out what's going on here. Why does God do this? Why, isn't this in a way putting an obstacle in front of someone, almost ensuring they're going to trip over it? That's been an argument that some commentators have made. Others see it differently. So keep that thought, take it to section, and read Elaine Pagel's work and some of the other interpretations. That's something people have struggled with for centuries. Right? Where does this come from? Who's the serpent? What's he doing there? They're all very important. It is true, and maybe this will go a little bit of the distance towards answering it. It's by eating of the fruit in defiance of God, human beings learn that they were able to do that they are free moral agents. They find that out. They're able to choose their actions in conformity with God's will or in defiance of God's will. So paradoxically, they learn that they have moral autonomy. Remember, they were made in the image of God, and they learn that they have moral autonomy by making the defiant choice, right? The choice for disobedience. The argument could be made that until they once disobeyed, how would they ever know that? And then you might raise all sorts of questions about, well, was this part of God's plan that they ought to know this and should know this so that their choice for good actually becomes meaningful? Is it meaningful to choose to do the good when you have no choice to do otherwise or aren't aware that you have a choice to do otherwise? So there's a wonderful 13th century commentator that says that God needed creatures who could choose to obey him. And therefore, it was important for Adam and Eve to do what they did and to learn that they have the choice not to obey God so that their choice for God would become endowed with meaning. That's one line of interpretation that's gone through many theological systems for hundreds of years. So the very action that brought them a godlike awareness of their moral autonomy was an action that was taken in opposition to God. So we see then that having knowledge of good and evil is no guarantee that one will choose or incline towards the good. That's what the serpent omitted in his speech. Right? He said, if you eat of that fruit, of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll become like God. It's true in one sense, but it's false in another. He's sort of omitted to point out. He implies that it's the power of moral choice alone that is God-like. But the biblical writer will claim in many places that true godliness isn't simply power, the power to do what one wishes. True godliness means imitation of God, the exercise of one's power in a manner that is God-like, good, life-affirming, and so on. So it's the biblical writer's contention that the God of Israel is not only all-powerful, but is essentially and necessarily good. Those two elements cannot become disjoined. They must always be conjoined in the biblical writer's view. And finally, humans will learn that the concomitant of their freedom is responsibility. Their first act of defiance is punished harshly. So they learn in this story that the moral choices and actions of humans have consequences that have to be borne by the perpetrator. So just to sum up, Sarna sees in the Garden of Eden story, as I've just explained it, a message that's in line with Kaufman's thesis about the monotheistic worldview. He says, the story conveys the idea that, quote, evil is a product of human behavior, not a principle inherent in the cosmos. Man's disobedience is the cause of the human predicament. Human freedom can be at one and the same time an omen of disaster and a challenge and opportunity. We've looked at Genesis 2 and 3 a little bit as an attempt to account for the problematic and paradoxical existence of evil and suffering in a world created by a good God. And that's a problem monotheism really never completely conquers. But other perspectives on this story are possible. And when we come back on Monday, we're going to look at it from an entirely different point of view and compare it with the Epic of Gilgamesh. We know of a very ancient Sumerian flood story. The hero of that one is Ziusudra, also on the board. We also know of a very early Semitic work, the Epic of Atrahasis, in which there's a flood. But the most detailed flood story we have actually comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, on the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. You'll remember that in his search for immortality, Gilgamesh sought out Utnapishtim, the one human who had been granted immortality. He wants to learn his secret. And when he begs for the secret of eternal life, he gets Utnapishtim's story, and it's the flood story. He learns that Utnapishtim and his wife gain their immortality by a twist of circumstances. They were the sole survivors of this great flood, and as a kind of reward, they were given immortality. The Sumerian story of Ziusudra is very similar to the Genesis account. In both, you have the flood coming about as the deliberate result of a divine decision. You have one individual who's chosen to be saved from the flood. That individual is given specific instructions on building an ark and is given specific instructions on who to bring on board the ark. The ark also comes to rest on a mountaintop. The hero sends out a bird to reconnoiter the land, to find out if it's dry yet. When the hero emerges, he builds an altar, he offers sacrifice to the deity, and receives a blessing. Very similar parallel stories. And yet, there are significant contrasts between the Mesopotamian story and its Israelite adaptation. Let's compare some of the elements from all three of the stories with the biblical story. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have no motive given for the divine destruction whatsoever. It just seems to be pure capriciousness. In the Epic of Atrahasis, we do in fact read of a reason, and the text there states, "The land became wide and the people became numerous. The land bellowed like wild oxen. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard the clamor and said to the gods, 'Oppressive has become the clamor of humankind. By their uproar they prevent sleep.'" So it seems that humankind is to be destroyed because they irritate the gods with their tumult and noise. In the Gilgamesh epic, Ea, an earth water god, does ask another god, Enlil, how he could have brought the flood on so senselessly. He says, "Lay upon the sinner the sin, lay upon the transgressor his transgression," which would indicate that in the Epic of Gilgamesh there is this element of capriciousness. The biblical writer, in retelling the story, seems to want to reject this idea by providing a moral rationale for God's actions. The earth, the text says, is destroyed because of Hamas. Hamas is a word that literally means violence, bloodshed, but also all kinds of injustice and oppression. Noah is saved specifically for his righteousness. He was righteous in his generation. He was chosen, therefore, for moral reasons. So the writer seems very determined to tell the story in a way that depicts God as acting not capriciously, but according to certain clear standards of justice. This was deserved punishment, and the person who was saved was righteous. Furthermore, in the Mesopotamian accounts, the gods do not appear to be in control. This is something that's been pointed out by many writers. Enlil wants to destroy humankind completely. He's thwarted by Ea, who drops hints of the disaster to Utnapishtim, so Utnapishtim knows what to do and therefore manages to escape the flood. But that's thwarting the design of the god who brought the flood. He wanted everything destroyed. When the flood comes, the gods themselves seem to have lost control. They're terrified, they cower. The text says they cower like dogs crouched against the outer wall. Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar, cried out like a woman in labor. And moreover, during the period of the flood, they don't have food, they don't have sustenance. And at the end, when Utnapishtim offers his sacrifice, the gods are famished and they crowd around the sacrifice like flies, the text says. The biblical writer wants to tell a different story. In the biblical flood story, God is represented as being unthreatened by the forces of nature that he unleashes and being completely in control. He makes the decision to punish humans because the world has corrupted itself through Hamas, through bloodshed and violence. He selects Noah due to his righteousness, and he issues a direct command to build an ark. He has a clear purpose, and he retains control throughout the story. At the end, the writer doesn't depict him as needing the sacrifice for food or sustenance. The Noah story, the flood story, ends with the ushering in of a new era, and it is in many ways a second creation that mirrors the first creation in some important ways. But this time, God realizes, and again, this is where God's got to punt all the time. That's what I love about the first part of Genesis. God is trying to figure out what he has made and what he's done, and he's got to shift modes all the time. And God realizes that he's going to have to make a concession. He's going to have to make a concession to human weakness and the human desire to kill. And he's going to have to rectify the circumstances that made his destruction of the earth necessary in the first place. So he establishes a covenant with Noah, a covenant. And humankind receives its first set of explicit laws. No more implicit, murder is bad. Oh, I wish I had known, right? Now we're getting our first explicit set of laws, and they're universal in scope on the biblical writer's view. They apply to all humanity, not just Israel. So these are often referred to as the terms of the Noahide covenant. They apply to all humanity. This covenant explicitly prohibits murder in Genesis 9, that is the spilling of human blood. Blood is the symbol of life. That's a connection that's made elsewhere in the Bible. Leviticus 17, right? The life is in the blood. So blood is the biblical symbol for life. But God is going to make a concession to the human appetite for power and violence. Previously, humans were to be vegetarian. Genesis 1, the portrait was one in which humans and animals did not compete for food or consume one another. Humans were vegetarian. Now God is saying humans may kill animals to eat them, but even so, he says, the animal's life is to be treated with reverence, and the blood, which is the life essence, must be poured out on the ground, returned to God, not consumed. So the animal may be eaten to satisfy the human hunger for flesh, but the life essence itself belongs to God. It must not be taken, even if it's for the purposes of nourishment. Genesis 9, verses 4 through 6. You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. Of every beast I will require it, and of humans. So if you are killed by a beast or a human, there will have to be a reckoning and accounting. Of every person's brother I will require the life of the person. Whoever sheds the blood of a person, in exchange for that person shall his blood be shed. For God made humans in his image. All life, human and animal, is sacred to God. The covenant also entails God's promise to restore the rhythm of life and nature and never again to destroy the earth. The rainbow is set up as a symbol of the eternal covenant, a token of the eternal reconciliation between the divine and human realms. And we should note that this notion or this idea of a God who can even make and keep an eternal covenant is only possible on the view that God's word and will are absolute, insusceptible to nullification by some superior power or some divine antagonist. Now, I handed out, or there was handed out to you, a sheet of paper. You might want to get that out in front of you, because we're going to talk a little bit about the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9. When we read the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9, we're often struck by the very odd literary style. I hope you were struck by the odd literary style and the repetitiveness and the contradictions. So I want to ask you now, and be brave and speak out. In your reading of the story, did anything of that nature strike you? Was the story hard to follow? Was it self-contradictory? And in what ways? Anything. Just don't even be polite. Just throw it right out there. Yes?
One said 2 every animals, and another one said 7.
Okay, we seem to have 2 sets of instructions, right? someone's pointing out here, we seem to have two sets of instructions about what to bring on board. Either to bring 2 of each sort of living thing, animals and birds and creeping things, or in another passage, God tells Moses to bring on 7 pairs of pure animals and 1 pair of impure animals and 7 pairs of birds, right? Different sets of instructions. Anything else strike you as odd when you were reading this story? Right, okay, rain seems to be there for different amounts of time, doesn't it? There are some passages in which the flood is said to last for 40 days or be on the earth for 40 days. We find that in Genesis 7, verse 17. But in Genesis 7, verse 24, 150 days is given as the time of the flood. Anything else? Any other sorts of doublets or contradictions? Because there are a few more. Who's giving the instructions? That's not hard. That's not hard. You have it right in front of you. Who's giving the instructions? Okay, God. We have the word God being used, I guess, in that translation, right, with a capital G. What else is used? Lord. Those are actually different Hebrew words underneath there. Okay? Those 2 terms are different names for the deity that's giving the instruction. Okay? So there are 2 designations used for God. Yahweh, which is the sacred tetragrammaton. It's written with 4 letters in Hebrew. They don't include vowels. We don't really know how it's pronounced. I'm guessing at Yahweh. And that is a proper name for God. And in your translation, that will be translated as Lord in small caps. So wherever you see Lord in small caps, that's actually the English translation for Yahweh. The proper name, like almost a personal name for God. And then in other places, we have this word Elohim, which actually is the word for gods, a sort of generic term for deities in the plural. However, when it's used to refer to the God of Israel, it's clearly singular. It always has a singular verb. So that will be appearing in your text as God with a capital G. Okay? So whenever you see Lord or God, those are actually pointing to different words that are being used in the underlying Hebrew text. Twice, God is said to look down on creation. Twice, it is said that he is displeased. Twice, he decides to destroy all living things. Twice, he issues instructions, and as we've seen, they're contradictory. We seem to also have a different account of how long the flood lasted. There are more subtle contradictions throughout as well. Sometimes the flood seems to be the result of very heavy rain, but in other descriptions, it seems to be a real cosmic upheaval. You'll remember the description of the world from Genesis 1 as an air bubble, essentially, that's formed by separating waters above and waters below, and they're held back or pressed back by the firmament above. And it's the windows in the firmament that are open. Those waters are allowed to rush in and dissolve that air bubble. It's as if we're back to square one with the deep, right? Just this watery mass again. So it's creation undoing itself in some of the descriptions, as opposed to just heavy rain. And in keeping with that idea of a kind of a return to chaos, Noah is represented in a way as the beginning of a new creation. Because like Adam and Eve in the first creation story, Noah is told to be fruitful and multiply. He's also given rule over everything, and that's now extended to the taking of human life. The Bible contains a lot of repetition and contradiction. And sometimes it occurs in one passage, as in the flood story here, and sometimes it occurs in stories or passages that are separate from one another. For example, the 2 creation stories. There are many significant differences between the 2 creation stories. They differ greatly in style. Genesis 1 is formalized. It's highly structured, right? It has the 7 days and everything's paired up. It's beautifully structured. It's very abstract. Genesis 2 is much more dramatic, much more earthy. The first creation story doesn't really contain puns and word plays. It's a little bit serious. The second creation story is full of them. There are all sorts of little ironies and puns in the Hebrew. Adam, the earthling made from the earth. Adam is made from Adamah. Adam and Eve are naked, arum, which is the same word for clever or shrewd, and the snake is arum. He's clever and shrewd. There are lots of little puns of this kind. There are also differences in terminology between the 2 stories. Genesis 1 speaks of male and female. It's one set of Hebrew terms, but Genesis 2 uses man and woman, a different set of Hebrew terms to describe the genders. So the terms for gender are different in the 2 stories. Genesis 1 refers to God as, in your translation, God, right? Elohim, the word that's translated as God. He's remote. He's transcendent. He creates effortlessly through his word and through his will. But Genesis 2 refers to the deity as a name that's really a combination. It's Yahweh Elohim. So you'll see Lord God, right? You see that a lot in the Bible as well. Lord God, that tells you both of those words are side by side in the original Hebrew. So in Genesis 2, the deity is Yahweh Elohim. He's much more down to earth. He forms the human like a potter working with clay. He talks to himself. He plants a garden. He takes a stroll in the garden in the cool of the evening. He makes clothes for Adam and Eve. He's spoken of in much more anthropomorphic terms than the God that we encounter in Genesis 1. So what we have in the first few chapters of Genesis are two creation stories. They have distinctive styles, distinctive themes, distinctive vocabularies, and they're placed side by side. In Genesis 6 through 9, we seem to have two flood stories with distinctive styles and themes and vocabularies and substantive details, but they're interwoven instead of being placed side by side. And there are many such doublets in the Bible. At times, we have whole books that repeat or go over the same material. In fact, the whole historical saga that's recorded from Genesis through the end of 2 Kings is rehearsed again in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. What are we to make of the repetitions and the contradictions here and throughout the Bible? What are the implications? Suppose you came across a piece of writing that you knew nothing about, just lying there on the table. You didn't know who wrote it, where, when, how, why. And someone says to you, I want you to draw some conclusions about that piece of writing. I want you to draw some conclusions about its authorship and the way it was compiled or composed. And so you pick it up and you start reading, and you notice features like this. What might you conclude? Throw it out. What might you conclude? No presuppositions. You pick up the work, and you find these features. What might you conclude about its authorship or manner of composition? Yeah. You might conclude that there are multiple authors, right? Multiple authorship. Yeah. That revisions may have been made so that you might have different sources that have been revised or put together in different ways, right? Revisions implying you've got something and then it's worked over again. Additions might be made, so now that's a new source, right? You might conclude that these features are evidence of multiple authorship, a good deal of revision, which points itself to a kind of composite structure, different layers, maybe different sources. Well, as early as the Middle Ages, there were some scholars who noticed these things in the biblical text. They noticed that there were contradictions and repetitions, and there are anachronisms too, other features that were evidence of multiple authorship, revisions, and composite structure. So what? Why would that be a big deal? Okay, we can all go home then. There's no problem with that, right? Why would that be a big deal? Yeah.
It's a central text for your religion. If there are contradictions, you've got a bit of a problem finding what exactly you believe.
Okay, it could be a bit of a problem if this text has become the basis for a system of religious faith or belief, and your assumptions about it are that it's telling a truth that is singular in nature. And also, what about the traditional beliefs and the origin of this text? Right? Who wrote this text according to traditional beliefs? I'm hearing Moses, I'm hearing God, I'm hearing a bunch of different things, but right, there are traditional ideas about generally the Mosaic authorship of the Bible, certainly the first 5 books of the Bible. And so these features of the text, which were noticed, were a challenge to traditional religious convictions regarding the Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Bible, and in many ways the perfection of the Bible, as speaking with a unified voice on matters of doctrine or religious theology. So medieval commentators, for example, began to speak a little bit more openly about some of these features. One of the first things they noticed is that Deuteronomy 34 describes the death and burial of Moses. So they decided it was possible that Moses didn't write at least that chapter. Similarly, there are some anachronisms that they had to explain. One of the most famous is in Genesis 13, verse 7. It's in the midst of a story about dividing the land between Lot and, at that time his name is Abram, it later becomes Abraham, but between Lot and Abram. And the narrator, in telling this story, sort of interjects and turns to us, the readers, and says, the Canaanites and Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. Now, what's weird about that sentence? The narrator is speaking to us from a time in which the Canaanites and Perizzites don't live in the land, right? He's saying, that's back when the Native Americans lived in Connecticut. Is that writer living at a time when Native Americans are still living in Connecticut or owning Connecticut? No, they're writing from a later point of view. So the narrator breaks and talks to the audience in Genesis 13 and 7, says, that was back in the time when the Canaanites were in the land. When did Moses live? Who lived in the land in the time of Moses? The Canaanites. I know you haven't gotten there yet, but when you get to Deuteronomy, you're going to find out he doesn't make it into the land. So he never makes it in there. He never gets in before the Israelites conquer. He dies. The Canaanites are still in possession. So that line was certainly written not by Moses. It was written by someone at a much later time who's looking back and referring to the time when the Canaanites were in the land. So these are the kinds of things that people began to notice. And with the rise of rationalism in the modern period, traditional notions of the divine and Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, were called into question. The modern critical study of the Bible begins really with Spinoza, who in the early 17th century suggested that the Bible should be studied and examined like any book, without presuppositions about its divine origin or any other dogmatic claims about its composition or authorship. But it was a Catholic priest, Richard Simon, who first argued that Moses didn't write the Torah and that it contained many anachronisms and errors. We've run out of time, but I'll pick up this fascinating story on Wednesday, and we'll learn a little bit more about critical ideas about the composition of the Bible. Please be on the lookout for emails from section leaders with study guides for sections, which will be meeting this week. You'll have a lot of fun with the creation stories. We were talking last time about evidence of the use of different sources in the biblical text. And I mentioned Richard Simon, who was the first to argue that perhaps Moses wasn't the author of the entire Torah. In the mid-18th century, a fellow named Jean Astruc first noticed the use of the name Yahweh in certain stories and passages, and the name Elohim in others. And on this basis, he came and others came to identify what have come to be known as the J and E sources, J being pronounced Yah in German, right, as a Y, so Yahweh is spelled with the J, so the J and the E sources. Now, Astruc actually happened to maintain the idea of Mosaic authorship. He argued that Moses was drawing from 2 separate long documents, which he identified as J and E. And they used different names for God, and he was drawing on those in his composition of the Torah. But in the next century, his work would be expanded by Germans who identified other sources that made up the Pentateuch, especially, the first 5 books of the Bible especially. And in 1878, we have the classic statement of biblical source theory published by Julius Wellhausen. He wrote a work called The History of Israel, and he presented what is known as a documentary hypothesis. Now, you've read a little bit about this in your source readings, but it's the hypothesis that the historical or narrative sections of the Bible, Genesis, and stretching on really through 2 Kings, is comprised of 4 identifiable source documents that have been woven together in some way. And he argued that these documents date to different periods and reflect very different interests and concerns. These 4 prior documents, he says, were woven together by somebody or some group of somebodies to form the narrative core of the Bible. And Wellhausen argued that these sources, therefore, do not tell us about the times or situations they purport to describe, so much as they tell us about the beliefs and practices of Israelites in the period in which they were composed. This is going to be an important claim. This is an important predicate of the documentary hypothesis. So although the sources claim to talk about events from creation, actually, forward, Wellhausen says, no, they really can only be used to tell us about the beliefs and religion of Israel from the 10th century, which is when he thinks the oldest was written, and forward. Now, his work created a sensation. It undermined, of course, traditional claims about the authorship of God and the work of Moses. It's still disputed by conservative groups and Roman Catholic authorities, although Roman Catholic scholars certainly teach it and adopt it. The 4 sources that were identified by Wellhausen are, as I said, the J source and the E source, but also P, the priestly source, and D, which is primarily the book of Deuteronomy. Now, as I said, the first 2 sources are named because of the names of God that they employ. But it goes a little deeper than that. According to J, the knowledge of the proper or personal name, if you will, of God, Yahweh, begins with the first human, with the Adam, So already in Genesis 4, Adam seems to know this name and refer to God by this name. If we look at other sources, such as P and even E, Yahweh's name is not known to humankind until he chooses to reveal it to Moses, and this happens in the time of the Exodus. So in Exodus 6, verses 2 to 3, which is assigned by source critics to the P source, the priestly source, God appears to Moses and he tells Moses then that he is Yahweh. He says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs before you, as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yahweh. So the P source has a different sort of theology, if you will, of God's name, or the revelation of God's name. And the same sort of thing happens in Exodus 3, verses 13 to 16, and that's assigned to the E source. So once you've identified rough blocks of material according to not just the name of the deity, but also their assumptions about when humankind knows the name of the deity, then you could analyze these blocks or chunks of text and begin to identify certain characteristic features, their style, the terminology they use. And source critics were able to come up with a list of what they believed were the main characteristics of the various sources. So the main characteristics of the J source, which begins with the second creation story. So the J source picks up in Genesis 2, verse 4, second half of verse 4. It uses the personal name Yahweh for God from the time of creation, and that will be in your Bibles as Lord. It describes God very anthropomorphically. It's the J source that has God shut the door of the ark after Noah. It's the J source that has God smelling the sacrifice after the flood, the sacrifice that Noah offers. It's in the J source that God eats with Abraham and bargains with him. It's in the J source that God meets with Moses in this mysterious passage and tries to kill him one night. J has a very vivid and concrete earthy style. It uses the name Sinai, Mount Sinai, to refer to the place where the Israelites with Moses will conclude the covenant with God. As for the date, well, source critics felt that a clue to the dating of the J source could be found in the passage in which God promises a grant of national land to the Israelites. The boundaries of the land are given there as the river of Egypt, the Nile, and the Euphrates. And it was argued by some that those were basically the borders of the kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon. Think of 1000 as your date for David, and that's basically when the monarchy begins, all right? So the beginning of the 10th century, the argument is that under David and Solomon, the empire reached that boundary, and so clearly this is a writer from the 10th century who's seeking to justify Israel's possession of its kingdom from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, and is presenting that kingdom as a fulfillment of a promise of land that God made to Israel's ancient ancestors. And for that reason, source critics thought, J must date to about the 10th century, under the time of perhaps King Solomon. It also seems to reflect the interests of the South. Remember, we talked about the fact briefly that at a certain point in Israel's history, there's a division upon the death of Solomon in the late 10th century. The kingdom divides into a northern kingdom now called Israel and a southern, smaller kingdom called Judah. And the southern interests seem to be reflected in the J document. So, source critics decided this is a Judean document from the 10th century. The E source, which source critics say begins around Genesis 15, is really the most fragmentary. It seems to have been used to supplement the J source rather than to be used in any whole, in a larger form. So sometimes it seems very difficult to isolate, and there's a lot of debate over this. But the E source's characteristics are that it uses Elohim. Again, it's a plural form of the word God, or gods, but when it's used with a singular verb, it refers to the God of Israel. It has a much less anthropomorphic view of God. God is more remote. There aren't the direct face-to-face revelations in the E source. Most communications from the divine are indirect. They'll be through messengers or dreams. And there's also an emphasis on prophets and prophecy in the E source. Miriam, Moses, they're both referred to as prophets in the E source. The style is more abstract, a little less picturesque, and the E source uses a different name for the mountain where the covenant was concluded. It uses the name Horeb. All right? So you will sometimes see as you're reading the text they refer to Horeb instead of Mount Sinai, or you'll see the two names used interchangeably. And it's been the theory of scholars that that's because it comes from a different source. The E source seems to be concerned primarily with the northern tribes, therefore the northern kingdom. And so source theorists decided that it was most likely composed in the northern kingdoms about the 9th century. And then according to this hypothesis, the J and E sources were combined, primarily J with E being used to supplement it, probably somewhere in the 8th century, late 8th century. And that was the backbone of the Pentateuchal narrative. It covers the early history of humankind, Israel's early ancestors, known as the patriarchs and matriarchs. Their stories are told in Genesis. It contained the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt in the book of Exodus, and the stories of the wandering in the wilderness that are found in the book of Numbers. And the anonymous scribe or editor who combined these sources didn't care to remove any redundant material or contradictory material, as we've already seen. Now, there are two other sources according to classical source theory, and these are D and P. D, which is the Deuteronomic source, is essentially the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy differs from the narrative sources. This is a book of speeches. The book purports to be 3 speeches delivered by Moses as the Israelites are poised on the east side of the Jordan River. I'm not good with directions, I had to stop and think. The east side of the Jordan River, about to enter the promised land. But according to the source theorists, it clearly reflects the interests of settled agrarian life. It doesn't reflect the interest of people who've been wandering around nomadically. It has laws that deal with settled agrarian life. The main characteristic of D, however, which assisted source theorists in fixing its date, is the following. D is the one source in the Bible that clearly insists that one central sanctuary only is acceptable to Yahweh. God cannot be worshipped at makeshift altars. God cannot be worshipped through sacrifices at some local sanctuary. All sacrifices must be offered in the one central sanctuary where he will cause his name to dwell. It doesn't actually ever say Jerusalem, which is why Samaritans think that it's at Mount Gerizim and that they have the correct temple and they're authorized to offer sacrifices, right? They got it wrong when they thought it was Jerusalem. Samaritans think that that's where God caused his name to dwell. So Jerusalem is not actually mentioned in Deuteronomy. That's a later reading. But the place where God will cause his name to dwell, and only there, at the temple there, can there be sacrifices. This is a very different perspective from other biblical books. So you're going to see in the stories of the patriarchs that they're wandering all around the land and they're offering sacrifices. And there are other books too where it's clear there are local shrines, local sanctuaries, local priests who are offering sacrifices for people throughout the land. But Deuteronomy insists one central sanctuary. All of the outlying altars and sacred places must be destroyed. Now, centralization of the cult was a key part of the religious reform of a king of Judah in 622. I've marked a couple of dates on the timeline up here. So 722 is the fall of the northern kingdom. 622, a reform by King Josiah in Judea. We read about this in one of the historical narratives where the temple's being refurbished. A book is found that says one central sanctuary. King Josiah says, what have we been doing? Get rid of the outlying altars. Everything has to be centralized here. So that reform, the Josiah's reform, has caused many scholars to associate Deuteronomy, the centralizing book or source, with the late 7th century, around this time in Judah. The trouble is, D seems to reflect a lot of northern traditions, the interests of tribes who are in the north. Well, the northern kingdom was destroyed in 722, so this is the theory. Source critics conclude that D is an old source. It was originally composed in the north, in the 8th century. When the northern kingdom fell, when the Assyrians conquered, and many Israelites would have fled to the southern kingdom, Deuteronomy, or the D source, was brought to Jerusalem, stored in the temple, where 100 years later it was discovered and its centralization was put into force by King Josiah. P is the priestly source, and that is found mostly in the books of Leviticus and the non-narrative portions of Numbers. Now, the major characteristics of P, the priestly source, are a great concern with religious institutions, with the sacrificial system, with the Sabbath, with holidays, with rituals like circumcision, the Passover, dietary restrictions, the laws of kashrut, the system of ritual purity and impurity, and also holiness, ethical holiness and cultic or ritual holiness. P does have some narrative, and you've read some of it. Genesis 1, the first creation account, is attributed to P. It's orderly, it's systematized, the God is extraordinarily abstract, because in the P source, another characteristic is that God is transcendent and even perhaps remote, much more so than in J, for example. Generally, in the P source, God is concealed and revealed only in his kavod. This is a word that's often translated as glory, but what it refers to actually is a light-filled cloud. God seems to be the burning fire inside this light-filled cloud. He travels before the Israelites in that form, leading them through the wilderness and so on. That seems to be in the P source. P is also interested in covenants, in censuses, in genealogies. All of those sections, very often that link stories, are attributed to the P source. And because P elements often serve that kind of function as a bridge between stories, or very often P sources seem to introduce a story or conclude a story, the source critics felt that priestly writers were probably responsible for the final editing of the Bible, bringing together J and E and D and adding their materials and finally editing the work. Now, Wellhausen dated the priestly source to the period, the exilic period, to the period after the fall of the southern kingdom in 586, when the Babylonians have taken many of the Judeans into exile in Babylon. So P, J, and the narrative parts of P, J, and E are continuous parallel accounts of the history of the world, if you will, from creation until the death of Moses. Source critics believe that they have a uniform style, uniform vocabulary, uniform set of themes, and a chronological framework. So according to Wellhausen, and I've sort of schematized it chronologically for you up here, the priestly school drew together all of this older material, added some of its own editorial material, bridges, introductions, conclusions, inserted the large priestly documents of Leviticus and Numbers. And so the Torah, and they did this sitting in exile in Babylon, and so the Torah is really the result of 5 centuries of religious and literary activity. And this, of course, is a very, very different portrait from traditional claims about the authorship of the Pentateuch by one man, Moses, in approximately the 14th century BCE. There are different terms that we use to describe the modern critical study of the Bible in the late 19th century, as I've just described it. One term is literary criticism, because it proceeds by closely analyzing the literary features of the text, the terminology, the style, the motifs. But because the goal of this literary critical school was to identify specific sources, isolate sources, we also refer to it as source criticism. You'll see those terms used interchangeably in your literature. Today, literary criticism has a slightly different connotation from what it was in the 19th century, so people prefer the term source criticism, but you should know both are used. Because, however, the purpose of identifying and isolating these sources was not just to say, look at that, there are these different sources. The purpose was to ascertain, as far as possible, their relative dates to one another, and to therefore enable the work of historical reconstruction to proceed. Primarily a reconstruction of the history of the religion of Israel and the historical situation of the authors of the different sources. And therefore, literary criticism is not only called source criticism, it's also called historical criticism, because its ultimate goal and purpose was not just to isolate the sources, but to arrange them, all right, according to relative dates, as far as they might be ascertained, and then to chart changes in Israel's religion. The source critical method we talked about today focuses on the hypothetical period of the compilation of the text, compilation of the 4 sources into the Torah. But later scholars began to ask, but what about the prehistory of those sources? What were the sources' sources? Why should that be important? Remember that the source critics claimed and concluded that J, E, P, and D were written from the 10th to the 6th centuries, And the implication, well, actually not just the implication, the strong assertion of many of them was that despite the fact that they purport to tell of events prior to 1000, in fact, they're just not at all reliable for those periods. They were written centuries after the fact. We really can't know anything about Israel, Israel's religion, Israel's history, religious history before the 10th century. That was a very dissatisfying conclusion to many people, because the writers of J, E, P, and D probably didn't sit down at typewriters and just invent their documents out of whole cloth. Doesn't seem that that's the way these materials would have been composed. They didn't invent, probably, all of these cultic rules and ritual practices all of a sudden. It seems likely that they were drawing on older traditions themselves, older stories, older customs, older laws, ritual practices. And so scholars in the next wave of biblical scholarship began to ask a different set of questions. They became interested in asking, what materials did the compiler or the compilers of J or E or P draw on in the composition of those sources? Did they use more ancient materials? And if so, can we figure out what they were? And do they contain reliable traditions for an earlier stage? And if so, then maybe we do have access, after all, to information regarding Israelite history prior to the year 1000. And so suddenly you see an analytical approach to the Bible that's going to pull in the exact opposite direction from the classical source theory. And one of the leading scholars to take up this question was Hermann Gunkel, whose name is at the top over there. Gunkel had a great knowledge of the oral literature of other cultures, other nations, and that led him to ask, can we perhaps analyze these 4 literary source documents and figure out the pre-literary stages of their development? What went into their compilation and composition? And he found support for this idea within the Bible itself, because at times the Bible seems to name earlier sources quite explicitly. We don't have records of those sources anymore, but they seem to be named in the Bible. In Numbers 21:14, there's a little poetic excerpt that gives the boundaries between Moab and the Amorites. And it's quoted, and it says it's from the book of the Wars of the Lord. And it's quoted as if this is a source that the person is drawing on and using in the composition of his text. And it's quoted in a way that makes it sound as if the source should be familiar to the reader. We also have mention of something called the Book of Yashar in Joshua. That's also quoted, Joshua 10:13, or in 2 Samuel 1:18, we have David lamenting, a very beautiful lament over the death of Saul and his beloved Jonathan. And it seems to actually be an epic song that recounts acts of Israel's heroes, and he's reciting that now as he laments over the death of these two. And so it seems to be an earlier source that's been put into the story of David and his lament. So it seems reasonable in light of the practices of other people, other ancient cultures and literatures, as well as some contemporary literatures. And it seems reasonable in light of the explicit citation of sources in the biblical text to suppose that, in fact, the 4 primary documents are themselves compilations from other source materials or drawing on written or oral material from an even earlier period. So Gunkel began to focus on small little units. He was interested in small units within the 4 primary documents, and he identified genres or forms, what he called forms. The German word is a Gattung, Gattungen, forms. He would identify these small units, and that gave rise to the name of this approach, which is form criticism. He believed that what he was doing was identifying older pre-literary forms that had been taken up and incorporated by the literary sources, by J, E, P, and D. Examples of the kinds of forms, a Gattung, that he would identify were things like a hymn, a proverb. We also often have biblical texts quoting proverbs that seem to be folk sayings, laws, rituals, folk stories of a particular type, poems, legends, songs, fragments of mythology. So, for example, he says of Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, a passage that you've read, when men began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among them that pleased them. The Lord said, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he too is flesh. Let the days allowed to him be 120 years. It was then, and later too, that the Nephilim, these giants of some kind, appeared on earth, when the divine beings cohabited with the daughters of men who bore them offspring, these giants, these Nephilim, and they were the heroes of old, the men of renown. And it's just stuck in there in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. He says this is an older a fragment of a mythology or a legend which is put into place here. It's explaining the origin of heroes and great men of renown in the old days. He also says that there are etiological stories. We've talked about those, legends that give the origin of a name or a ritual or an institution. There are different types of etiological stories. He says there are ethnological legends that will give you the story accounting for the origin of a particular people. So the Moabites, for example, and the Ammonites, not a flattering story at all, following the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Obviously, the Israelites didn't care for those people very much and gave them a pretty nasty origin. We also have etymological legends, because they're explaining the name of something. It's given this particular name because of an etymological connection with some event earlier. So all of these things, he argues, are probably older existing traditions that have been taken up and adapted by the biblical writer, and they may preserve some historical reminiscence. More important than the actual events that they might be reporting, is the fact that behind each of these is some sort of function. Each one of these did some sort of cultural work. It had some function or setting in life. And that's what we can discover when we isolate these forms, this setting in life. And that helps us learn something about ancient Israelite society or culture way before the 10th century. That's Gunkel's claim. God learned immediately after creating this unique being that he will exercise his free will against God. God saw that he had to limit the lifespan of humans or risk creating an enemy that was nearly equal to him. So he casts the humans out of the garden, blocks access to the tree of life. But humans continue their violent and evil ways, and in desperation, God wipes them out and starts again. And this second creation proves to be not much better. They forget God, they turn to idolatry. God has promised at this point, however, not to destroy all humankind again. So he experiments with a single individual of faith. And Abraham's faith withstands many a trial. He is obedient to God in a way that no one has been up to this point in the narrative. But perhaps ultimately the model of blind obedience is rejected too. When Abraham prepares to slaughter his own son, perhaps God sees that blind faith can be as destructive and evil as disobedience. So God relinquishes his demand for blind obedience. He stops Abraham himself. The only relationship that will work with humans is perhaps one in which there is a balance between unchecked independence and blind obedience. And God seems to find that relationship with Jacob. And the metaphor for that relationship is a metaphor of struggle or wrestling. Remember, Israel means one who wrestles, who struggles with God. God and humans lock in an eternal struggle, neither prevailing, yet both forever changed by their encounter with one another. So Joseph's betrayal by his brothers, his descent into Egypt, set the stage not only for the reformation of his brothers' characters, which is an important part of the story, but for the descent of all of the Israelites into Egypt so as to survive widespread famine. So yet another threat to the promise is overcome. The threat of famine is overcome by the relocation to Egypt. Significantly, God says to Jacob in Genesis 46, verse 4, I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back. So in short, there seems to be a plan afoot, right? The writer wants to represent God's going down there and he will bring them back. Israel's descent to Egypt sets the stage for the rise of a Pharaoh who, the text says, didn't know Joseph and all that he had done for Egypt. And this new Pharaoh will enslave the Israelites and so embitter their lives that their cry will rise up to heaven, the same cry from the generation of the flood, the same cry from Sodom and Gomorrah. And thus begins the book of Exodus, which will lead us from Egypt to Sinai. Most of the narrative account in Genesis 12 to 50 is, with the exception of the Joseph story actually, but most of Genesis 12 through 50 is assigned by scholars to the J source. And certain themes emerge in the J narrative. The first is that while God's promise is sure, the manner and the timing of its fulfillment is quite unpredictable. The land never belongs to the patriarchs to whom it was promised. Their descendants will take possession of it, but only after tremendous struggle. In other ways, God's methods are curious. Why does he go against the traditional ancient Near Eastern practice of primogeniture, inheritance by the firstborn? He chooses Jacob, a liar and a cheat in his early life, over the elder Esau. Why does he choose young Joseph, who's an arrogant, spoiled brat? He provokes his brothers with his delusions of grandeur. Compare the law of primogeniture that's listed in Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 to 17. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the unloved one, when he wills his property to his sons, he may not treat as firstborn the son of the loved one, in disregard of the son of the unloved one who is older. And yet, isn't this what happens to Ishmael? Isn't this what happens to Esau? Isn't this what happens to all of Joseph's brothers who are born before him? And there's no explanation in the text. Yet despite the false starts and the trials and the years of famine and the childlessness and the infertility, the seed of Abraham survives, and the promise is reiterated. I will go down myself with you to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back. So ultimately, the J source would appear to assert God does control history, all tends toward his purpose. And the book of Exodus is really the sequel, then, to the book of Genesis. Despite God's promise of land and blessing, things don't look so good at the end of Genesis. The book closes with the Israelites residing in Egypt. They've managed to procure no more than a burial plot in the promised land. Even God has left his land, descending with the Israelites into Egypt, so the promises and their fulfillment seem quite remote. The book of Exodus will relate the beginning of the process by which the promises will be fulfilled. Now, the historical value of the Exodus story has fascinated scholars, but also lay people for generations. Could the Exodus really have happened? And if so, when? And does it matter? And is there any evidence for the story, for example, in external sources outside the Bible? Well, no, there isn't any direct evidence outside the Bible. But let's start at the beginning. We do have a victory hymn that's inscribed on a stele, a sort of slab of stone, I guess, which was erected in the year 1204 BCE. It was erected by a pharaoh, Pharaoh Merneptah. So the stele of Merneptah dates to about 1204. And in this victory hymn, he's boasting of his victory over various groups in Canaan. And one of the groups he claims to have defeated is Israel. Now, this is a fabulously important inscription because it's the earliest known reference outside the Bible to any person or entity that is mentioned in the Bible. And it suggests that a people known as Israel was indeed in the land of Canaan by the end of the 13th century BCE. Whether they arrived there after an exodus from Egypt is not, of course, indicated. The source doesn't tell us that. And in fact, there's really no archaeological evidence of a large group, entering the land of Canaan at this time. There's a steady cultural continuum, not evidence of destruction as we would expect for a big invasion. We'll talk more about that when we get to the book of Joshua. But nevertheless, let's just go with this for a minute. And if we suppose that it took about a generation to enter the land, so you see I've done the math on the side here. I suppose I should have done subtractions since we're talking BCE. But if we put 20 years in for actually arriving and settling in the land, that takes us to about 1225. And if we assume 40 years of wandering in the desert or wandering from Egypt, that takes us to about 1265 as a date for the Exodus. Well, in 1265, the 18th dynasty's most illustrious pharaoh occupied the throne, Ramses II, who in fact was pharaoh for 70 years or something, most of the 13th century. And he's very famous for his building projects. Now, according to the biblical record, the Hebrews were set to work on urban building projects in the Delta region, where the Nile, at the north part of the Nile, the Delta region of the Nile, in the cities of Pithom and Ramses. The Bible states that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. So if we add that, then that would put her descent into Egypt, Joseph, the other sons of Jacob, around the year 1700. Well, there's a certain appeal to that scenario, because in the 1720s, Egypt was invaded and conquered by a Semitic people known as the Hyksos. They established a dynasty of Semitic rulers. They were centered in the north of Egypt, in the area known as Goshen. So it's possible that the pharaohs of the Hyksos dynasty might have favored other Semites. They might have allowed them to enter in times of famine and to dwell in the land of Goshen, which the Bible says the Israelites lived in the land of Goshen. So that Joseph, a Semitic foreigner, could be elevated to an important post, the post of governor, is a little less surprising if we suppose there was a Semitic regime. In the 16th century, the native Egyptians, who were smarting and smoldering under the humiliating foreign rule of the Hyksos, finally succeeded in rising up and driving them out and reestablishing a native Egyptian dynasty. So some scholars have speculated that that's the historic reality behind the statement in Exodus 1, verse 18, that a new Pharaoh who knew nothing of Joseph and what he had done for Egypt began to oppress the Hebrews. The feeling is that the establishment of a new native Egyptian dynasty might have led to the enslavement of any remaining Semites or Semitic outsiders, and that would include, of course, the Hebrews. So in all probability, anyone who was associated with the hated occupying regime would be treated poorly, and it all seems to fit. But there's a problem with this theory. The Bible itself contains very contradictory statements regarding the length of the Israelites' stay in Egypt. So Exodus 6, verses 16 to 20, says that the Israelites were there for only 4 generations, maybe 80 years, from Levi to Moses. Levi was the great-grandfather of Moses. So only 4 generations, which would mean an arrival in Egypt a long time after the Hyksos, not 430 years. And we don't even know whether migration occurred in the Hyksos period, so what we have really is only a hypothesis. The 430 years number is also something of an ideal number. It places the Exodus 480 years before Solomon's building of the temple. 480 is a multiple of 12, and the Bible really likes multiples of 12. So it is an ideal number. It's the kind of number that crops up a lot in biblical chronologies, which makes it suspect for other sorts of reasons as well. So the Hyksos theory is one that got people very excited for a while, but is really not well supported. But still, there's some very interesting circumstantial evidence for Semites engaged in building projects in the 13th century, however and whenever they may have gotten to Egypt. We do know archaeologically that the fortified city of Pi-Ramses, very much like Pitom Ramses, was rebuilt in the early 13th century on the site of the old Hyksos capital. There was a capital, Avaris. They had moved the capital up to the Delta region. It had fallen into decay. Now in the 13th century, this is being rebuilt, and that's in the area of Goshen. So the city was being reoccupied in the time of the Pharaoh Ramses, Ramses II, in the 13th century. We do know that Egyptian officials allowed hungry nomads to enter the Delta region for food. We have written records of this. We also know that Semitic slaves are well attested in Egypt at this time, the end of the 13th century. We also have records of that. We know of a people called the Hapiru or Apiru. They don't seem to be an ethnic group so much as a marginalized social class, but some have suggested a connection with the word Hebrew. We know that they worked on the building of the capital city of Ramses II. Other scholars deny there would be any connection with Hebrew. The debates are endless. One 13th century Egyptian papyrus describes Egypt's tight control of her border areas, and another reports some Egyptian officials pursuing some runaway slaves. Obviously, this happened from time to time, escaping into the desert. The Exodus story also contains many Egyptian elements. The names, Moses, Aaron, Pinchas, these are all Egyptian names. Moses is simply this part of Ramses, Tutmosis, Ramesses. This is Egyptian for born of the god Ra. The name Moses is an Egyptian name. So none of this, of course, corroborates the specific details of the biblical story. There's no Egyptian record of the biblical Moses, no record of plagues, no record of a defeat of Pharaoh's army. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence, and some scholars think that that lends plausibility to a story of slaves working on building projects who escaped from Egypt at this time. And if there's any historical basis to the Exodus, then the most plausible time, the most plausible backdrop would be the 13th century BCE. Some scholars assume there's a historical memory behind the elaborate and dramatic story of a miraculous redemption by God, Why would you invent a hero, a national hero, who's entirely Egyptian and has an Egyptian name? Why would you invent a myth of origins in which your ancestors are slaves? Nevertheless, as I emphasized earlier in the patriarchal stories, in the end, we are dealing here with sacred history. We're dealing with a highly embellished and theologically interpreted myth of origins for a nation. So much more important than historical verifiability is the conviction of the ancient Israelites who received and venerated these traditions and developed them and embellished them, that God had once acted on their behalf, rescuing them from bondage, binding them to himself in an eternal covenant. Now, the situation of the Israelites in Egypt, the text says, remains bitter. Exodus 2:23-24. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. One day, in the wilderness, at a place called Horeb, also Sinai, where there's a mountain, Moses sees a flame in a bush that doesn't consume the flame. And then he hears a voice, and the voice says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hides his face in fear, but God continues. He has a job for Moses. I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and have heeded their outcry because of the taskmaster. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. Come, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. It's Exodus 3, verses 7-10. And Moses demurs. Right? Who, me? Why not my big brother Aaron? He's a much better public speaker. This is the line that he takes. I'm slow of tongue. But as we've already seen in Genesis, God chooses who he chooses, and his reasons aren't always fathomed. Moses says, may I say who sent me? He asks for God's name. The Israelites will want to know who has sent me. And God replies with a sentence, Eheye asher eheye. This is a first-person sentence that can be translated, I am who I am, or perhaps I will be who I will be, or perhaps I cause to be what I cause to be. We really don't know, but it has something to do with being. So he asks who God is. God says, I am who I am, or I will cause to be what I will cause to be. So Moses, wisely enough, converts that into a third-person formula. Okay, he will be who he will be. He is who he is. Yahweh, Asher Yahweh. So God's answer to the question of his name is with this sentence. And Moses converts it from a first-person to a third-person sentence. He will be who he will be. He is who he is. He will cause to be. I think most people think now what he will cause to be. And that sentence gets shortened to Yahweh. This is the Bible's explanation for the name Yahweh. And as the personal name of God, some have argued that the name Yahweh expresses the quality of being, an active, dynamic being. This God is one who brings things into being, whether it's a cosmos from chaos, or now a new nation from a band of runaway slaves. But it could well be that this is simply God's way of not answering Moses' question. We've seen how the Bible feels about revealing names, and the divine being who struggled and wrestled with Jacob sure didn't want to give him his name. So I've often wondered if we're to read this differently. Who am I? I am who I am, and never you mind. But there are certain important and unique features of this burning bush dialogue. First, God identifies himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as numerous commentators have pointed out, in so doing, the biblical writer is trying to establish an unbroken historic continuity between the present revelation to Moses and the revelations and promises that are received by Israel's forefathers, the patriarchs. And yet, paradoxically, the very assertion of continuity only serves to underscore a fundamental discontinuity. Because even as God asserts that he is the God of the patriarchs, he reveals to Moses a new name, Yahweh, so that Yahwism and the Yahweh cult can be said to begin only with Moses. Now, as we've seen, the biblical sources differ on this point. According to the J source, in Genesis 4:26, the earliest humans worshipped Yahweh as Yahweh. The name was always known. J wants to assert a direct continuity between the God of the patriarchs and the God of the Exodus. The P and E sources tell it a little differently. Exodus 6, verses 2 to 4, very important passage. Exodus 6, verses 2 to 4. It's assigned to P. And here God says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yahweh. Now this contradicts the J source. And many scholars have suggested that P and E preserve a memory of a time when Israel worshipped the Canaanite god El. P and E wish to claim that the God who covenanted with the patriarchs is the God of the Exodus, but now with a new name. They also, like J, they want to assert a continuity, but in doing so, they do it in a way that really ultimately draws attention to the fundamental discontinuity, the sense of a new beginning. And to understand that new beginning, we need to look at the differences between patriarchal religion and the new Yahwism, the titles of God. And you'll see that in the patriarchal traditions, all right, so we're talking about Genesis primarily. I've thrown in some other texts also, but focusing for a moment on the patriarchal traditions of Genesis, God is 6 times called El Shaddai. Other names are El Elyon, El Olam, El Roi, El Bethel. You can see the translations of these. The everlasting God, God Most High, a God of seeing, the God of the house of God, and so on. El is the name of the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon. Flip over to the other side of your handout, where I discuss an important set of texts that were discovered at a place called Ras Shamra. Ras Shamra was ancient Ugarit. In 1928, a peasant in Syria discovered a tomb at Ras Shamra, which was subsequently excavated by the French, and it was found to contain a library of tablets that were written in a language very, very close to Biblical Hebrew. It's clear that Hebrew is simply a Canaanite dialect. In fact, I remember reading one scholar said if you go back far enough, you're really hard-pressed to tell the difference between Canaanite and Hebrew. And in these texts, we read of the exploits of the gods of Canaanite religion. These gods include the sky god El, I've listed here, the father of the various gods and humans. El has a wife, Asherah, she's listed 3rd on your paper, a mother goddess, their daughter Anat, who is a goddess of love and war, she's quite fierce, and then their son Baal, who is a storm god. He's depicted in mythological literature as defeating both the chaotic sea god, the sea god Yam, and the god of death, Mot. There are striking resemblances between the biblical God of the patriarchs and the Canaanite god El. El is the head of the council of gods. He is said to have a long white beard. He dwells on a mountain top in a tent. His epithets include father of all creatures, bull, king. He is also described as the protector of patriarchs, patriarchal figures, a god of the father of the clan, it says in the texts. He guides them, he protects them, he promises them descendants. Many biblical passages depict God exactly this way, as the head of a council of divine beings. He's occasionally described with some of the epithets that are associated with El. He's referred to as the father of all creatures. There are poetic passages in which he is referred to as bull, also certainly as king. And in the patriarchal narratives, God refers to himself as the God of the Father. I am the God of the Father, the same way El is referred to. He guides and protects the patriarchs. He makes promises of progeny to Abraham and his heirs. He also is associated with a mountaintop, Sinai, and gives instructions for the building of a tabernacle, a tent-like structure in which he will dwell. Many personal and place names in the patriarchal narratives are compounds in which one element is El. Yisrael, Yishmael, Beth El. El is the God of the patriarchs. By contrast, after the time of Moses, Israelite names start to be formed using Yah or Yahu as part of the name Yahweh. Elijah in Hebrew is Eliyahu. So you start to have theophorics, names that use a name of a deity, which are using forms of Yahu instead of El. There are other descriptions in the Bible of God, which are much more reminiscent, however, of the storm god, Baal. According to Canaanite mythology, Baal defeated El and assumed his position at a certain point as the head of the Canaanite pantheon. So there was a switch in Canaanite mythology from El to Baal becoming supreme. Like Baal, Yahweh is said to ride on the clouds. We have a poetic passage in which that's the case. His revelations are accompanied by thunder, storms, earthquakes. Baal is the god of the storm. There are poetic fragments also that allude to Yahweh's victory over watery foes, and that is a motif that's associated with Baal, who does battle with the Yam, with the sea. And finally, also associated with Israel's God, we have ancient Near Eastern holy war traditions. God is depicted as a warrior who leads his host, the Lord of hosts, in battle. He's armed with spear and bow and arrows. The worship practices of ancient Israel and Judah clearly resemble what we know of Canaanite and ancient Near Eastern worship practices. Canaanite religious ritual took place in small temples that housed cultic statues. There were stone pillars, perhaps symbols of the gods or memorials to the dead. There were altars for animal sacrifices, cereal, liquid sacrifices. Similarly, Israel's God was worshipped at various high places. They're referred to as elevated or high places. These were shrines with little altars, maybe cultic pillars, and wooden poles. The word for a wooden pole that's used in the Bible is Asherah. These shrines may have been associated with some kind of contact with ancestors, some kind of cult of the dead. Now, worship at these local altars and high places will come to be banned. Deuteronomy is going to polemicize against this. Deuteronomy will insist that all worship must occur in one central sanctuary, and these outlying areas and their asherot are to be destroyed. It will decree the destruction of all of these altars and high places. The patriarchal stories are clearly not the work of the Deuteronomist. And these stories must have had very long-standing traditional authority if they were adopted without serious modification by the Deuteronomist redactor, some modification, but not serious. So what is going on here? What are we to make of the incredible similarity of Israel's deity and cult to those of her neighbors? How are we to understand the rise of Israel's God, Israel's religion? Well, so far we've had two models that have been thrown out to you, the kind of classic evolutionary model. From polytheism's worship of many gods, there's a natural evolution to henotheism's denial of all gods, elevation of one God to a supreme position. Sort of one comes to be favored, and then eventually becomes so important to the others, really fall away, and you have really the denial of all gods but the one. We saw Kaufman in the 1930s reacted against this. He argued that monotheism and polytheism are so radically distinct that one could not possibly have evolved from the other. Surely there's an element of truth in both models. The evolutionary model is, I think, responding to and picking up on the fact that in many respects, Yahweh resembles the gods of Israel's neighbors. To be blunt, the patriarchs seem to have worshipped the Canaanite god El. The problem with the evolutionary model is that it doesn't account for those aspects of the biblical text that show a clear polemical relationship between Israel's religion and that of her neighbors. Now, we saw when we read Genesis 1 that there was something going on there. There's a polemic going on. All right? There are strata within the Bible that are clearly polemicizing against certain kind of mythological presentation of the deity. By contrast, Kaufman's revolutionary model focuses almost exclusively on the dissimilarities and the polemical relationship between Yahwism and Canaanite polytheism. So the revolutionary model also fails because it doesn't acknowledge the many, many areas of contact, similarity, and even identity. So a third way has emerged in the last 20 years or 15 years or so, and it's one that seeks to avoid this dichotomy between polytheism and monotheism. Instead of viewing Israelite religion as an evolution from and a refinement, just this natural process of refinement of Canaanite religion, or as a radical break with and polemic against Canaanite religion, you have some biblical scholars, Mark Smith is among them, Stephen Geller, who examine the cultural and ideological negotiations that gave rise to Israelite monotheism. What do I mean? Mark Smith specifically describes the origin and development of Israelite religion as a process of what he calls convergence and differentiation. He writes, "Convergence involved the coalescence of various deities and/or some of their features into the figure of Yahweh. There is a period of convergence and blending of the deities." By contrast, he describes differentiation as a process whereby Israel came to reject its Canaanite roots and create a separate identity. At some point, there was a desire to separate, and in that process of identity formation, a polemic began to develop that created a Yahweh in a distinct way, differentiated from the Canaanite deities. So let's consider Smith's convergence first. The Canaanite roots of Israel's ancestors are clear. The Hebrew language itself is essentially Canaanite dialect. The Canaanite god El was, from the biblical text, the god of Israel's earliest ancestors. Through a process of convergence, he argues, the god Yahweh was a god that we think originally came from a region further south, Sinai, Edom, somewhere further south. But this god, through a process of convergence and cultural mixing, began to take on the characteristics of other deities, first El, and then Baal, or sort of simultaneously El and Baal. Later, certain aspects of this convergence would be polemicized against and rejected as a Yahweh-only party sought to differentiate itself from those that it would now label as other and call Canaanites, as distinct from Israelites. Smith's model of convergence and then differentiation has great explanatory power. It explains the deep similarity of Israel's deity and the deities of her neighbors, but it also explains the vehement biblical polemic against Canaanite religion and Baal worship in particular, which we will come to see. It reminds one of sibling rivalry, right? Siblings who obviously share a tremendous amount and can be extraordinarily similar are precisely the siblings who can struggle and wrestle the most to differentiate themselves from one another. Smith's model of convergence and differentiation also avoids unhelpful dichotomies. Israel is either like or unlike her neighbors, right? That's not helpful. It helps us understand Israel's God as the end product of familiar cultural processes, the processes of convergence. We see convergences of cultures all the time, and differentiation. Differentiations of culture happen all the time as well. When and why, you may ask, did this differentiation occur? When and why did some Israelites adopt a Yahweh-only position and seek to differentiate what they would call a pure Yahwism from the cult of Baal, for example? The debate over that question is fierce, and it's one we're going to leave for another day. We will come back as we continue moving through the biblical text, and we will address that question. But to sum up, it's clear that the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs are not strict Yahwists, as we will come to understand that term. The P and the E sources depict or preserve the insight. They preserve this insight, and they preserve it in their insistence that the patriarchs worshipped God as El, but at the time of the Exodus, God revealed himself as Yahweh. It's an interesting passage in the book of Joshua, Joshua 24, verses 14 to 15. Joshua, who's the successor to Moses, he presents the Israelites with the following choice. Now, therefore, revere the Lord, using the word Yahweh. Revere Yahweh and serve him with undivided loyalty. Put away the gods that your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt. Put away the gods your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. Choose this day which ones you are going to serve, but I and my household will serve Yahweh, serve the Lord. Only later would a Yahweh-only party polemicize against and seek to suppress certain, what came to be seen as undesirable elements of Israelite Judean religion. These elements would be labeled Canaanite as a part of a process of Israelite differentiation. But what appears in the Bible as a battle between Israelites, pure Yahwists, and Canaanites, pure polytheists, is indeed better understood as a civil war between Yahweh-only Israelites and Israelites who were participating in the cult of their ancestors. So, following the theophany at the burning bush, Moses returns to Egypt, and he initiates what will become ultimately a battle of wills between Pharaoh and God. And the story in Exodus has high drama and lots of folkloric elements. including this contest between Moses and Aaron on the one hand and the magicians of Egypt on the other hand. And this kind of contest is a very common literary device. It's a kind of, our boys are better than your boys device. The Egyptian magicians, who are initially able to mimic some of the plagues that are brought on by God, they are quickly bested, and Yahweh's defeat of the magicians is tantamount to the defeat of the gods of Egypt. There are 10 plagues. These include a bloody pollution of the Nile, swarms of frogs, lice, insects, affliction of livestock, boils that afflict humans and animals, lightning and hail, locusts, total darkness, and all of this climaxes in the death of the firstborn males of Egypt in one night. And source critics looking at this material discern numerous diverse sources that are interwoven throughout. And these sources preserve differing traditions on the number and the nature of the plagues, as well as the principal actors in the drama, God, Moses, Aaron. So according to the source critical analysis, no source contains 10 plagues. I think J has 8 and E has 3 and P has 5, and some of them are the same as one another and some of them are different and so on. Some of them are unique to one source, some are not. But ultimately, the claim is that these have all been merged and have left us then with an overall total of 10. This may in fact be true. Nevertheless, as much as we like to engage sometimes in this kind of analysis about the sources that have gone into the composition of the text, it's also always important to keep your eye on the final form of the text as we've received it. Literary analysis that is sensitive to the larger contours of the account will reveal the artistic hand of the final editor. I've charted this at the top of the board here. Some scholars have noticed that the plagues are organized in 3 sets of 3. And there are literary links that connect them and make it clear that these are 3 sets of 3, followed by the climactic 10th plague. And again, 3 and 10 are ideal numbers in our biblical texts. In this last plague, God, or his angel of death, passes over Egypt at midnight, slaying every Egyptian firstborn male. Moses orders each Israelite to perform a ritual action, and this action will protect them from the slaughter. And the ritual consists of 2 parts. Each family is told to sacrifice a lamb. The lamb will then be eaten as a family meal, and its blood will be smeared on the doorposts to mark the house so the angel of death knows to pass over that house. And the pun works in Hebrew as well as in English, which is kind of handy. In addition, each family is to eat unleavened bread. So according to Exodus, this Passover ritual was established on Israel's last night of slavery while the angel of death passed over the dwellings that were marked with blood. The story attests to a phenomenon that's long been observed by biblical commentators and scholars, and that is the Israelite historicization of pre-existing ritual practices. In other words, what we probably have here are 2 older, separate springtime rituals. One would be characteristic of semi-nomadic pastoralists, the sacrifice of the first lamb born in the spring to the deity in order to procure favor and continued blessing on the flocks for the spring. The other would be characteristic of agriculturalists. It would be an offering of the very first barley that would be harvested in the spring. It would be quickly ground into flour and used before it even has time to ferment to quickly offer something to the deity, again to procure favor for the rest of the crop. It's supposed by many that Israel was formed from the merger or the merging of diverse groups, including farmers and shepherds in Canaan. The rituals of these older groups were then retained and then linked to the story of the enslavement and liberation of the Hebrews. So you have older nature festivals and observances that have been historicized. They're associated now with events in the life of the new nation rather than being grounded in the cycles of nature. This may in fact be then part of the process of differentiation from the practices of Israel's neighbors who would have celebrated these springtime rituals. So now the blood of the sacrificial lamb is said to have protected the Hebrews from the angel of death, and the bread now is said to have been eaten, consumed in unleavened form because the Hebrews left Egypt in such a hurry. They had no time to allow the dough to rise. Historicization, and we'll see this historicization of rituals recurring again and again. Now, following the last plague, Pharaoh finally allows the Israelites to go into the desert to worship their God. But he quickly changes his mind, and he sends his infantry and his chariots in hot pursuit of the Israelites, and they soon find themselves trapped between the Egyptians and something referred to as Yam Suf, meaning Reed Sea. It isn't the Red Sea. That's a mistranslation that occurred very, very early on, so it's led to the notion that they were at the Gulf of Aqaba or somewhere near the actual big ocean water. And some of the Israelites despair, and they want to surrender. Was it for want of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt, saying, let us be, we will serve the Egyptians, for it's better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses rallies them, and then in the moment of crisis, God intervenes on Israel's behalf. And once again, source critics see in the account of the parting of the Reed Sea in Exodus 14 and 15, 3 different versions of the event that have been interwoven. I have to stress, though, that scholars differ very much on where the seams in the text are, what parts of the story belong to J or E or P. So you'll read very, very different accounts. There's some consensus, but a lot of disagreement. One thing that most people do, in fact, agree on is that the oldest account of the event is a poetic fragment that's found in Exodus 15, verses 1 to 12 in particular. This is often referred to as the Song of the Sea. And here, the image is one of sinking and drowning in the Sea of Reeds. You have a wind that blasts from God's nostrils. The waters stand straight like a wall. And at a second blast, the sea then covers the Egyptians, and they sink like a stone in the majestic waters. The hymn doesn't anywhere refer to people crossing over on dry land. It seems to depict a storm at sea, almost as if the Egyptians are in boats, and a big wind makes a giant wave, and another wind then makes it crash down on them. So they're swamped by these roiling waters. But the name Yam Suf, Reed Sea, implies a more marsh-like setting rather than the open sea. John Collins, who's a professor here at the Divinity School, he points out that this image, particularly in poetic passages, this image of sinking in deep waters, it occurs often in Hebrew poetry. It occurs particularly in the book of Psalms, and where it's a metaphor for distress. In Psalm 69, the psalmist asks God to save him, "For waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and flood sweeps over me." But a few verses later, it's clear that the poet isn't really drowning. This is a metaphor for his difficult situation. "More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Many are those who would destroy me, my enemies who accuse me falsely." So Collins suggests that the poem in Exodus 15 is celebrating and preserving a historical memory of an escape from or a defeat of Pharaoh, and that the drowning image is used metaphorically, as it is elsewhere in Hebrew poetry, to describe the Egyptians' humiliation and defeat. Later writers take this poetic image and fill out the allusion to drowning in this ancient song and compose the prose accounts in Exodus 14, in which the metaphor is literalized. According to these prose accounts now, Pharaoh's army was literally drowned in water. But even in the prose accounts in Exodus 14, we can see a composite of 2 intertwined versions. In the material that's usually associated with P, Moses is depicted as stretching out his staff, first to divide the waters, which stand like a wall so that the Israelites can cross over on dry land. And then he holds out his staff to bring the waters crashing down on the Egyptians. But according to one little section, this is just verses 24 and 25 in Exodus 14. Some attribute this to J. It seems that the Egyptians were stymied by their own chariots. The image we get there is that the Israelites are sort of working their way through the marsh on foot, and the Egyptians' chariot wheels can't make it through the marsh. They get stuck in the mud, and this forces them to give up the chase. So the final narrative that emerges from this long process of transmission, perhaps a core image of escape on foot where chariots are bogged, a poem that describes the defeat in metaphorical terms using a drowning and sinking image, and then prose elaboration, on these previous traditions that have a very dramatic element of the sea being parted and crashing down on the Egyptians. A long process of transmission, interweaving, literary embellishment has gone into the creation of this account in Exodus 14 and 15. But the story as it stands reiterates a motif that we've seen before, that of the threatened destruction of God's creation or God's people by chaotic waters, and of divine salvation from that threat. What's interesting about the Song of the Sea, this poetic fragment in Exodus 15, is that here the Hebrews adopt the language of Canaanite myth and apply it to Yahweh. If you still have that sheet that was handed out before listing different epithets for Baal and listing epithets for Yahweh, it would be handy to have that or to take a look at it later again, because the description of Yahweh is that of a storm god in Exodus 15. He heaps up the waters with a blast of wind, like a storm at sea. And this is reminiscent of the Canaanite storm god Baal, as you see on your handout. Baal is said to ride on the clouds. He's a storm god, and he's accompanied by wind and rain. At the beginning of the rainy season, Baal opens a slit or makes a slit in the clouds and thunders and shakes the earth. In one important legend that we have from the Canaanite text, the Ugaritic texts, he defeats an adversary who's known as Prince Sea or Judge River. And after he vanquishes this watery foe, he is acclaimed the king of the gods and the king of men, and he is housed in a home, not a tent, as El was. El was housed in a tent, but now this Baal is housed in a permanent structure, a home that is on top of a mountain and is built of cedar. Now, ancient Hebrew descriptions of Yahweh employ very similar language in the poetic passage here in Exodus 15, but also in other poetic passages. So, for example, Psalm 68, verse 5. Extol him who rides the clouds. The Lord is his name. Yahweh is his name. So, extol him who rides the clouds. Yahweh is his name, as if to say, not Baal. So, Yahweh is described like Baal as riding on the clouds. Psalm 29 also employs the language of a storm god. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, the Lord, over the mighty waters. Some scholars think this actually was originally a psalm about Baal that was simply adopted and referred to Yahweh. Images of God engaged in a battle with some kind of watery foe also appear in the psalm. Psalm 74. O God, my king from of old, who brings deliverance throughout the land. It was you who drove back the sea with your might, who smashed the heads of the monsters in the waters, and so on. Judges 5 is also another ancient song fragment in verses 4 to 5 that uses the same kind of imagery. Now, Michael Coogan, who's a very important biblical scholar and an expert in the Canaanite text, the Ugaritic materials, he's made some intriguing observations in connection with the biblical representation of Yahweh in terms that are so reminiscent of the storm god Baal. He notes that Baal was the key figure in a change in the religion of Canaan that happened somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE. And that is also the traditional time for what we think of as the Exodus and the introduction of Yahwism, or the differentiation of Yahwism. At this time, somewhere in this period, there was a transfer of power in the Canaanite pantheon, so that from a transfer of power from the older gods to the younger gods. The older god El, the sky god, was replaced by the younger storm god Baal, and he was replaced by virtue of his defeat of Prince Sea, or whoever this watery foe is. So El is replaced by Baal after a defeat of some watery foe. Coogan notes that at about the same time, there seems to have been a similar change in many of the world's traditions, or many of the traditions of the region. You have a younger storm god who usurps power from an older god by virtue of a victory over a water god. Remember Enuma Elish, which we read at the very beginning of the semester. You have the young storm god Marduk, who defeats Tiamat, the watery, ferocious, deep monster, and does so by blasting a wind into her, and so establishes his claim to rule instead of the old sky god, An or Anu. In India, the storm god Indra, about this time, assumes the place of a previous god, Dios. And in Greece, Zeus, who is associated with the storm, right? Thunder, lightning bolts. You think of in the hands of Zeus, he replaces Kronos, who had been the head of the pantheon. And so here in Exodus, we find that just as the nation of Israel is coming into existence, just as the Israelites are making the transition from a nomadic existence to a more settled way of life ultimately, in their own land, there seems to be a collective memory of a similar change in her religion. Like the storm gods in the myths of Israel's neighbors, Yahweh heaps up the waters with a blast of wind. He wins a stunning victory. He establishes himself as the God of the Israelites in place of El, who was worshipped by Israel's patriarchs, remember? And like the Canaanite god Baal, Yahweh, as we will see as we continue to read the text, he will eventually want a house for himself atop a mountain, Mount Zion, and it will be lined with cedar. There are, of course, important ways in which Israel's use of the storm god motif diverges from that of other ancient Near Eastern stories. The most important is that Yahweh's battle is a historic battle rather than a mythic battle. Right? The sea is not Yahweh's opponent, right? Nor is Yahweh's enemy another god. Yahweh is doing battle here with a human foe, the Egyptian Pharaoh and his army. The sea is a weapon deployed. It's a weapon in the divine arsenal, and it's deployed on behalf of Israel. But again, Yahweh is depicted by the biblical writer as transcending nature, using forces of nature for a historical purpose, acting in history to deliver his people and create a new nation, Israel. So just as in Genesis 1, the universe is created when the wind of God parts the primeval waters, so in Exodus 14 and 15, a new nation is created when the wind of God parts the waters of the Reed Sea. But to describe what was understood to be a historic event, a one-time event, not a recurring mythical event, but a historic event, the ancient Israelites employed language and images drawn naturally from the traditions and myths of their broader cultural context, or I should say that were the cultural context in which they themselves existed, while at the same time differentiating themselves to some degree. Now, as has long been noted, the Exodus event became the paradigm of God's salvation of his people. And when I say salvation, I don't mean that in the later Christian sense of personal salvation from sin. That's a notion that's anachronistically read back into the Bible, into the Hebrew Bible. It's not there. Salvation in the Hebrew Bible does not refer to an individual's deliverance from a sinful nature. This is not a concept we find in the Hebrew Bible. It refers instead to the concrete, collective, communal salvation from national suffering and oppression, particularly in the form of foreign rule or enslavement. When biblical writers speak of Yahweh as Israel's Redeemer and Savior, they are referring to Yahweh's physical deliverance of the nation from the hands of her foes. We're going to see this increasingly as we move into the prophetic material. So the Exodus is a paradigm for salvation, but it would be a mistake, I think, to view the Exodus as the climax of the preceding narrative. Right? We've gotten to this point now, and we have this big dramatic scene at the Reed Sea. But the physical redemption of the Israelites is not, in fact, the end of our story. It's a dramatic way station in a story that's going to reach its climax in the covenant that will be concluded at Sinai. And as many sensitive readers of the Bible have noted, the road from Egypt leads not to the other side of the Reed Sea, but on to Sinai. God's redemption of the Israelites is a redemption for a purpose that doesn't become clear until we get to Sinai. For at Sinai, the Israelites will become God's people, bound by a covenant. And so the story continues. In the 3rd month after the Exodus, the Israelites arrive at the wilderness of Sinai. And they encamp at the mountain where Moses was first called by God, the text says. The covenant concluded at Sinai is referred to as the Mosaic covenant. So this is now our 3rd covenant that we have encountered. We will have one more coming. And the Mosaic covenant differs radically from the Noahide and the Abrahamic or patriarchal covenants that we've already seen, because here, God makes no promises beyond being the patron or protector of Israel. And also, in this covenant, he sets terms that require obedience to a variety of laws and commandments. So the Mosaic covenant is neither unilateral, this is now a bilateral covenant, mutual, reciprocal obligations, nor is it unconditional like the other two. It is conditional. So this is our first bilateral conditional covenant. If Israel doesn't fulfill her obligations by obeying God's Torah, his instructions, and living in accordance with his will as expressed in the laws and instructions, then God will not fulfill his obligation of protection and blessing towards Israel. In the post-exilic period, at some point, the entire unit, the Genesis through Numbers material, Deuteronomy, and then the lengthy historical narrative all the way through 2 Kings, was solidified. The Deuteronomistic history is sort of an odd conclusion to the Genesis through Numbers material, because it doesn't really have the expected narrative climax. You sort of expect the story to end with the entry of the Israelites into the land, and hopefully under Moses, and that doesn't occur. Some scholars have suggested that deferring Israel's possession of the land to the future may have reflected the historical experience of exile, an experience which challenged the very idea of the possession of the land as central to the maintenance of the covenant. So if you are in exile, then perhaps a more satisfying ending is to have Israel not in fact entering the land. The complex process by which Deuteronomy was formed underscores the fact that modern notions of authorship cannot be applied to biblical texts. We think of an author, we tend to think of an author as a discrete individual who composes a text at a specific time. But this isn't the way that texts came into being in the ancient world, particularly important communal texts. As Weinfeld points out, the biblical authors were what we would call collectors, compilers, revisers, editors, and interpreters of ancient tradition. Ancient texts were generally the product of many hands over the stretch of many long centuries. And during that time, modifications and recontextualizations occurred. And so we refer to those who transmit and develop a text in this way as a school. But you need to understand that we are using that in a relatively informal way. So when we talk about the Deuteronomic school or the Deuteronomistic school, we're really talking about the fact that we have a set of texts that all seem to share a certain sort of ideology or orientation, and yet we know that parts of them seem to date from very, very different times. And so we think of that text as being preserved, transmitted, and developed by many hands who share certain commonalities, common ideologies, so we call it a school. It's not that we know of the existence of a Deuteronomistic school, and we say, oh, well, then they must have produced this text. It's the other way around. We have a text, and its features suggest to us a long-standing tradition of scholarship, right, that preserved and transmitted the text in that way. Same with the priestly school. We're speaking about the priestly materials, which clearly have evidence of originating from the 8th, 7th, 6th, and 5th centuries, and so there must have been a common stretch of scholarship that would have preserved and transmitted and developed those traditions, and we call that the priestly school. Now, there are striking similarities between Deuteronomy's religious program and the major religious reforms that were carried out in the 8th century by King Hezekiah, but even more so in the 7th century by the King Josiah, around 622, King Josiah. This is a reform that's reported in the book of 2 Kings. In 2 Kings 22, this reform has long been noticed and provides scholars with the basis for dating the core materials of Deuteronomy, dating them to the late 7th century. According to the story in 2 Kings, during temple repairs that were being done in the time of King Josiah, the scroll of the Torah, that's how it's phrased, the scroll of the Torah was found. And when it was read, the king was distressed because its requirements were not being upheld. Now this term, the scroll of the Torah, as I said, does not occur in Genesis through Number. It is a phrase that occurs in Deuteronomy 17. Then continuing the account in 2 Kings, Josiah is said to take action. He assembles the people, he publicly reads the scroll, the people agree to its terms, and then Josiah's reforms begin. We hear that he purges the temple of vessels that had been made for Baal and Asherah that were in the temple of Yahweh. He removes all foreign elements from the cult. He prohibits sacrifice to Yahweh anywhere but in the central sanctuary. He destroys all of the high places. This refers to sort of rural shrines that were scattered throughout the countryside where local priests and Levites might offer sacrifices for people. Ritual shrines and pillars being used in the worship of Yahweh, these are deemed to be quite legitimate in the J and E sources. The patriarchs are doing this sort of thing all the time, building altars all around the country. But it's Deuteronomy that contains commandments to destroy the worship, first of all, the worship of other gods, but also the worship of Yahweh in high places or in rural shrines. So this is evidence, again, that what Josiah found to base his reforms on was something like the book of Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy that contains the prohibitions of high places and so on. After these reforms, it's reported that the Passover was celebrated. It was celebrated not as a family observance in individual homes. It was celebrated as a national pilgrimage festival celebrated by everyone in Jerusalem. That's how its celebration is described in the book of Deuteronomy. It's described as a family celebration in individual homes in the other books of the Bible. So again, this is another basis for the conclusion that the scroll of the law found by Josiah and guiding his reforms was something like the legal core of Deuteronomy. Scholars now think that that legal core of Deuteronomy was produced in the northern kingdom of Israel, which fell in 722, you'll recall. It was probably produced there in the 8th century, and that is supported by the fact that Deuteronomy has affinities with some prophets, with the writings of some prophets we'll be looking at later from the northern kingdom of the 8th century, such as the prophet Hosea, and we'll see this when we look at Hosea's writings. It also has affinities with the E source, which is also connected with the northern kingdom. In the 9th and 8th century, the northern kingdom was the site of a struggle against Baal worship. It was also home to certain prophets, such as Elijah and Elisha, who are known for their zealotry and their exclusive Yahwism. So some scholars think that was going on in the 9th, 8th century in the north, this sort of Yahweh-only party that was working hard and struggling against Baal worship. And they think that those Yahweh-only traditions were brought south after the fall of the northern kingdom in 722. You had refugees coming south. They brought these traditions with them. Some of these written materials were put into the temple. And then about a century later, during Josiah's time, when the temple was being refurbished, they were found. Possibly this material was then worked into a larger scroll, given its Mosaic introductions and so on. And that all contributed to Josiah's reform. So the centralization of the cult also needs to be understood against the larger political backdrop of the late 7th century. The Assyrian threat loomed large. You have to remember that the northern kingdom has already been completely destroyed. 10 tribes exiled, deported, and essentially lost. The southern kingdom managed to escape destruction, but only by paying tribute as a vassal to Assyria. So Judah, the southern kingdom, is a tribute-paying vassal state to the Assyrian overlord. And of course, there's a great deal of Assyrian cultural influence and religious influence in Judah as a result. So 2 Kings tells us that there were foreign forms of worship being introduced right into the temple. Josiah's reforms have been interpreted by some as an attempt to assert the political and the cultural and religious autonomy of Judah. Unregulated worship throughout the land was no longer going to be acceptable. The people were going to be united around a central, standardized Yahweh cult, which would be purged of any Assyrian influence or foreign influence. And this was deemed as necessary to stand up against or to survive the Assyrian threat. So it's in that context that we can look at the very strong parallels that exist between the book of Deuteronomy and certain Assyrian treaties from the 7th century. We already talked about the Hittite vassal treaties as a model for the Israelite covenant when we were talking about Exodus. But Deuteronomy is clearly dependent on another model, and that is the Assyrian vassal treaty. The best exemplars of these treaties are the treaties of the Assyrian Emperor Esarhaddon. He was a 7th century ruler of Assyria down to about 669. These treaties were discovered about 50 years ago. And Moshe Weinfeld is one of the people who's done a tremendous amount of work with these treaties, and he's argued at great length that Deuteronomy reworks the 2nd millennium Hittite model in accordance with the covenantal patterns that are evident in the 1st millennium vassal treaties of Esarhaddon. We see history being used as a motivational tool, and we see laws being reinforced by curses. And it's fascinating if you line up some of the curses in Esarhaddon's treaties with the curses in Deuteronomy. There's an amazing correspondence. Deuteronomy also includes blessings. The Assyrians didn't do that. Weinfeld notes that the Assyrian treaties are really loyalty oaths that are imposed upon vassals rather than true covenants. And Deuteronomy is also something of a loyalty oath, except that the people are pledging their loyalty to a god rather than to a human king. So you have the exhortation to love the Lord your God. I mean, think back to some of that language that we heard as I read Deuteronomy 30. The exhortation to love the Lord your God, to go after God, to fear God, to listen to the voice of God. These are all typical of pledges of loyalty. And they're paralleled in the Assyrian treaties, where the vassal has to love the crown prince. He has to listen to the voice of the crown prince. The same phraseologies are used. So it is a political literary form, but it's borrowed and it's referred to God. The Assyrian treaties also will warn against prophets or ecstatics or dream interpreters who will try to foment sedition. If you'll notice in Deuteronomy 13, we have something quite similar, a warning against false prophets who will try to foment sedition, lead the people to the worship of other gods. Some scholars refer to Deuteronomy as a kind of counter-treaty, if you will, right? A subversive document that's trying to shift the people's loyalty from the Assyrian overlord, right, to God, the true sovereign, right? And it's part of a national movement. Deuteronomy differs in style, in terminology, in outlook, and in theological assumptions from the other books of the Torah. As a series of public speeches, it adopts a highly rhetorical tone, a very, sometimes an almost artificial style. It's the style of a very skilled preacher, almost. It employs direct address, you, sometimes in the singular, sometimes in the plural, but Moses is constantly speaking in a very personal tone, direct address. And there are all sorts of hortatory phrases that exhort you. To do this with all your heart and soul. Do this in order that it may go well with you. The land is described as a land where milk and honey flow. And if only you will obey the voice of Yahweh your God. This is the kind of language that's used here, and not so much in the other books. So let's isolate now some of the major themes of Deuteronomy before we close our study of the Pentateuch. First of all, as I've mentioned, the centralization of the cult. That's a key theme in the book of Deuteronomy, and it had very important effects. It brought Judean religion closer to monotheism because you have the insistence of worshiping one God in his one central sanctuary. Sacrifice was offered only on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which meant that slaughter of animals for meat in the countryside no longer has a sacral component to it. It's just ordinary, common, profane slaughter. There's evidence that that wasn't true before this reform, that if you wanted to kill an animal for meat, you had a kind of a makeshift altar out there in the field, and you would pour out the blood and give it back to God and so on. You might still pour out the blood, obviously, but there was previously a more sacral element to it. Now slaughter in the countryside was simply common, profane slaughter. As a result, you have a lot of rural Levites who are out of business now. A lot of people who would have officiated at local shrines, and they are out of business. That probably explains the fact that Deuteronomy makes special provision for the Levites and includes them in its in legislation, sort of social welfare legislation. There are provisions that are made for the Levites who are not going to be able to earn their income anymore at these local shrines. So many of them would have gone up to Jerusalem. And a real tension is going to develop between the Jerusalem priests and this class of Levites who are newcomers. And we'll see some of that tension played out in some other texts. So centralization of the cult, and that has some social ramifications. We also have the theme, a sort of a greater abstraction of the deity. This is something many people point to in the book of Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy and books that are related to it, those that are going to follow, consistently refer to the sanctuary as the place where Yahweh chose to cause his name to dwell. God himself isn't said to dwell in the temple, nor is the temple described as a house of God. The temple is always the dwelling of his name. The house is built for his name. Weinfeld asserts that this is in order to combat the ancient popular belief that God actually dwells in the sanctuary. Likewise, to eradicate or guard against the idea, which is implicit in earlier sources, that God sits enthroned on the cheruvim, on the cherubim, who guard his ark, Deuteronomy emphasizes that the function of the ark is exclusively to house the tablets of the covenant. That's its purpose. The ark cover isn't mentioned. The cherubim aren't mentioned. We don't have the image of this as a throne with the ark as God's footstool. So it seems to be a greater abstraction of the deity. Some abstraction is also apparent in the shift from visual to oral imagery in describing God's self-manifestations or theophanies. One hears God, but one doesn't see God in Deuteronomy. And that's very different from earlier texts where we're seeing a sort of a cloud-encased fire and so on. So the sanctuary is understood to be a house of worship as much as it is a cultic center, in which Israelites and foreigners alike may deliver prayers to God who dwells in heaven. So he is in heaven. This is a place of worship. That's not to say that sacrifice is abolished. It's not to say that sacrifice isn't important to Deuteronomy. Very far from it. It's an essential part of God's service for Deuteronomy. But Deuteronomy is less interested in cultic matters, and in any event, when it focuses on sacrifices, it focuses on a different aspect of those sacrifices. The sacrifices it talks about consist primarily of offerings that are consumed by the offerer in the sanctuary or are shared with the disenfranchised in some way. The Levite, the alien resident, the orphan, the widow, portions are given to them. So by emphasizing the obligation to share the sacrificial meal with disadvantaged members of society, Deuteronomy almost gives the impression that the primary purpose of the sacrifices is humanitarian, or at least personal, the fulfillment of a religious obligation or the expression of gratitude to God and so on. These are aspects of the sacrifices that are emphasized in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy also emphasizes social justice and personal ethics and neighborly responsibility. God's own righteous behavior on behalf of the weak and the oppressed is a model for Israel's righteous behavior. God assists the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, and that's the basis of Israel's injunction to assist them also. It's the basis for the humanitarianism that I mentioned earlier that seems to run through the laws of Deuteronomy 12 through 26. A further theme in Deuteronomy is the fact that the covenant concept entails the idea that each generation of Israelites understand itself as having been bound with God in the original covenant. So in Deuteronomy 5, verses 2 to 3, the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb, Sinai. It was not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, the living, every one of us who is here today. Now this is interesting because remember, this is a generation, the generation has died off that saw the Exodus in Sinai, right? So these are the children now, and they're saying, no, it was with us. Every one of us who is here today. So every generation of Israel is to view itself as standing at the sacred mountain to conclude a covenant with God. And that decisive moment has to be made ever present. That's a process that's facilitated by the obligation to study the laws, to recite them daily, to teach them to your children. These are instructions that are contained in Deuteronomy. Moreover, Deuteronomy 31 proclaims that every 7th year the Torah is to be read publicly, the entire thing. And Weinfeld argues that where many ancient Near Eastern cultures direct the king to write the laws for himself, to read them, it's only in Israel, he has yet to find a parallel, it's only in Israel that the law is a manual for both the king and the people. It's to be proclaimed and read aloud to the people on a regular basis every 7 years. Further theme of Deuteronomy is the emphasis on love. Weinfeld points out that the Assyrian treaties stress the vassal's love for the crown prince, but there's never a reciprocal love by the crown prince for the vassal. And Deuteronomy differs in this respect. Deuteronomy emphasizes God's gracious and undeserved love of Israel, and that's expressed in his mighty acts on Israel's behalf. The Deuteronomist makes it clear that God's great love should awaken a reciprocal love on Israel's part, love of God. Love of God here really means loyalty. The word that is used is a word that stresses loyalty. Love and loyalty are mere abstractions, however, without some sort of vehicle for their expression. And the vehicle for their expression then is God's Torah, the sum total of God's teachings and instructions and laws and guidelines which are supposed to ensure long life and prosperity in the land. That idea is found in a very important passage known as the Shema. This is a passage that's really a central expression of the love of God in Israel. And it's been singled out as a central part of the Jewish liturgy at a very early stage and continues to this day. It's so called because of the first word of the passage. It's in Deuteronomy 6. It begins in verse 4, and the first word is hear, Shema. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So love and loyalty to God is the foundation of the Torah, but Torah is the fulfillment of this love and loyalty, studying it and observing it and teaching it and transmitting it. Another key idea that occurs in Deuteronomy is the idea of Israel as the chosen people. This is, what we find it here for the first time. It's an expression of the particularity of Israel and its unique relationship with God. And that uniqueness is expressed by this term, bachar, which means to elect or to choose. This is the first time we encounter this. Yahweh has chosen Israel in an act of freely bestowed grace and love to be his special property. Deuteronomy 10, verse 14. Mark, the heavens to their uttermost reaches belong to the Lord your God, the earth and all that is on it. Yet it was to your fathers that the Lord was drawn in his love for them, so that he chose you, their lineal descendants, from among all peoples, as is now the case. This idea may be rooted in the ancient Near Eastern political sphere, in which sovereigns would single out vassals for the status of special property. And in fact, the word used is a word we do find in Exodus. But Deuteronomy contains statements of national pride, national exaltation. And unlike the priestly materials, which portray holiness as a future goal to be attained through the observance of God's Torah, you shall be holy to me by doing the following things, Deuteronomy speaks of Israel as holy now, and thus bound to the observance of God's Torah because of their holiness. You are a holy people to me, therefore you should do. So to put it, and this is perhaps to put it too crudely, for the priestly source, holiness is a goal to be attained through obedience to God's Torah. For Deuteronomy, holiness is a status to be lost through disobedience to God's Torah. When we come back, I just want to finish up with one or two last comments about a couple of key ideas or themes in Deuteronomy before we move on to the beginning of the Deuteronomistic history that starts in Joshua. This coming week, you'll be having midterms as part of your section meeting. And in addition, at 6 p.m. tonight, I'll be making the essay question available online. And if it gets to 6:01 and there's nothing online, somebody call me real fast, okay? All right, good, thanks. And good luck with the exams. We've talked about the documentary hypothesis. We've talked about the different sources that scholars believe they've been able to identify as comprising the 5 books of the Pentateuch. And one of the things I mentioned a couple of times are some of the debates that occur on the question of dating. There's a great deal of ideological baggage that's involved in the dating of the sources. One of the issues that I think is a real problem is the fact that the priestly source, P, is so often misjudged and maligned. I hope that the little bit of time that we spent on the priestly materials gave you some appreciation of its transformation of older Israelite rituals and traditions into symbolic practices that would communicate basic convictions about morality, convictions about holiness. I hope it gave you a sense of its communal ethic as opposed to an individual morality, the idea that the actions of every individual have an impact on society as a whole. But the anti-priest, anti-cult sentiment of European Protestantism is apparent in the history of biblical scholarship in the last few centuries. And it's apparent in that scholarship's negative assessment of the priestly source of the Bible. So for Wellhausen, the priestly source, which emphasizes cult and ritual, logically, it had to represent a late degenerate stage in the evolution of Israelite religion, because priestly, ritualistic, cultic practices, these are degenerations. These are movements away from true spirit-filled religion in his view. So according to Wellhausen, the early period of ancient Israel must have been characterized by a free, more natural form of religion, intimate relationship with God, unencumbered or unsullied by the legalistic, cultic obsessions of priests and cult. He argued that in 586, with the destruction of Jerusalem and the people were taken into exile in Babylon, that was when, in Babylon, the priests were able to assume control, and they were able to play on the exiles' overwhelming feelings of guilt and failure. And the priests were able to construct a new identity and religion that stressed the sinfulness of the people and the need for ritual purity and ritual observance and legalism as the road back to God. And they were able to write themselves back into the narratives and stories of Israel's past. And this, according to Wellhausen, was a degeneration. Well, this reconstruction of the evolution of Israelite history, Israelite religion, is really driven more by theological prejudice than it is by historical evidence. And it stems from an obvious projection of the Protestant-Catholic tension onto Israelite history. It also is driven very much by a successionist account of Judaism as being something that was moribund at the time of Jesus. Jesus came and revived this as a spirit-filled religion again when it had decayed and withered and degenerated like a dead tree, as Wellhausen refers to it. This isn't to say that all scholars who date P to the post-exilic period are motivated by the same problematic assumptions. That's certainly not the case. There are scholars of all stripes and allegiances who view P as late, and there is some very good objective evidence for dating parts of P to the post-exilic period, just as there's good objective evidence for dating parts of D and the other sources to the post-exilic period. So when it comes to dating the sources, certainly I would say all scholars agree that the priestly materials reach their final form in the exile or post-exilic period. So that's the 6th century, right? You're going to find out we're going to return from exile in the 530s, okay? So when we talk about the post-exilic period, we're talking about the period after the return. So the period of the exile is the 6th century, the bulk of the middle of the 6th century. So it certainly reached its final form in that period, as did Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch probably generally. Nevertheless, there are many data that suggest that the priestly sources retain very early strata, just as D contains pre-exilic or early material. P espouses a communal ethic, and post-exilic priests are going to turn increasingly to an individual ethic. Many sections of P do not seem to assume a central sanctuary. You'll remember that the idea of the central sanctuary really took hold in 622 with Josiah and Josiah's reform. So it becomes a real watershed for us in dating texts. Texts that are happy with the existence of shrines throughout the land of Israel are probably pre-Josiah, pre-622, pre-exilic. Texts that insist on a central sanctuary are probably Josiah's time or later. And there are many sections of P that don't seem to assume a central sanctuary. There are sections of P that do seem to assume a central sanctuary. More significantly, I think P contains no universal ban on intermarriage. It doesn't employ its purity laws or language to mark an inseparable boundary between classes within Israel or between Israelites and Gentile others. The use of purity and purity language to inscribe boundaries between Israel and other nations is very characteristic of the post-exilic period. We're going to see that when we get there. So it's very hard to understand P's silence in this regard if it stems entirely from the post-exilic priestly circles. So I think that instead of charting an evolution or a degeneration, as I have over on the side of the board, an evolution or a degeneration from J.E., the pure spirit-filled religion, to D, the humanitarian ethical religion, to P, cultic obsessiveness and guilt-ridden legalism, as is done or implied in some classical source theory, some, not all, it may be better to see these three as really representing three distinct and roughly contemporaneous strands of ancient Israelite tradition and experience told from their own perspectives. These materials were transmitted and developed by different circles within Israelite society over centuries, and they crystallized at different times. J.E. has fragments that are quite old, but it probably reached its final form before the centralization of the sanctuary. It's still comfortable with the existence of many sacred places throughout the land, so probably before 622. Deuteronomy contains northern traditions from before the fall of Israel, which was in 722, but it was clearly finalized in the exile. There are many passages that make it clear that it's written from an exilic perspective. And the priestly source likewise contains many, many older traditions, but reached its full and final form in the exilic or post-exilic period. So each of these complex, multi-layered sources, each one of them you can find different layers, each one possesses its own emphases, its own agenda, its own perspectives. Sometimes they complement one another. Sometimes they challenge and contradict one another, but they are not best seen as linear, as telling a neat linear story about Israelite religion flowering and fading. Their diversity has not been flattened or homogenized by the final editor of the text. It's been preserved in a manner that stimulates reflection and debate. The most salient feature of the Deuteronomistic school is the conviction that Israel's residence in the land is a function of its obedience or disobedience to the covenant with Yahweh. And that conviction is going to color its presentation, its evaluation, and its interpretation of Israel's history and her kings, right from Joshua right through to 2 Kings. Yechezkel Kaufman uses the term historiosophy, which I've written up here, historiosophy, to describe this material, where a historian might simply record events, as if that's such a simple thing to do, but let's go with that for a moment. A historian might simply record events, however selectively or partially, might try to indicate cause and effect where possible. But a historiosophy is a more conscious philosophy of history. It's seeking to ascertain the meaning of events, to draw larger philosophical, ideological conclusions from the events of history, and to point to the larger purpose or design of history. Not to say just what happened, but to say why it happened and what it means for us today that it did happen. So the Deuteronomistic history is not simply a history of Israel until the destruction of Jerusalem. It's a historiosophy. It's making an argument, and it's attempting to communicate the meaning and the significance of the events of that time. And it does so through a pattern, a literary pattern we will see, of reward and punishment. This is an important point, and as we begin to go through the material, we'll be coming back to this. We'll return to this idea. There are certain key features of Deuteronomistic thought that are evident from Joshua through 2 Kings. One is the belief in the divine election of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the city that is referred to in Deuteronomy when it says God will choose a place to cause his name to dwell. In the Deuteronomistic books, that place is going to be Jerusalem. There's also a belief in the divine election of David, David as the king of Israel and his dynasty. Now, it's interesting because the other 4 books of the Pentateuch never mention a king. They never talk about Genesis through Numbers. There's none of the legal materials say, when you have a king, this is what he shall do. It's only the book of Deuteronomy that assumes or prepares for a monarchy and contains legislation for a king and the things that he should do. So this again underscores the connection between Deuteronomy and the following books. Deuteronomy assumes a king. It's being written and redacted at a time when there is a king in Israel, there have been kings in Israel, and it's providing laws for the construction of an ideal monarchy. So David, the theme of David as the elected king of God, David also as the ideal king, is something else that's a theme of these books. Another theme that we see in these books, or feature of the Deuteronomistic school, is the emphasis on what we call the Yahwist prophets. Yahwist prophets, prophets like Elijah and Elisha. These prophets are held up as heroes and champions of religious purity. They are completely against any kind of mixture of Yahweh worship with other elements, any kind of syncretism. The other thing we see in the Deuteronomistic material is a preference for Judah, the southern kingdom, as compared with a very negative presentation of the northern kingdom, Israel. The northern kingdom, Israel, is going to come in for very, very bad press at the hands of the Deuteronomistic writers, which shows that they are probably favor or come from Judah. So the northern kings are going to be uniformly denigrated. They're going to be denigrated because they maintain cults that rival the central sanctuary in Jerusalem. And this is going to be what does them in. The other theme that we see throughout the Deuteronomistic material is the negative presentation of the Canaanites. But we'll talk more about who these Canaanites were and how complicated, in fact, that presentation is. Now, the books of Joshua and Judges that open the Deuteronomistic history, these books recount or relate the story of the conquest of the land of Canaan by the Israelite tribes and the early years of the settlement, and that's in Judges. To gain an understanding of some of the issues involved and the emergence of a tribal structure in the land, it's helpful to know something about the geography of Israel, which is why I've handed out for you a couple of different maps, but one that gives you physical features, and that's on the top. It has often been pointed out that in the past 4,000 years, more wars have been fought for the possession of the tiny strip of land known as Canaan or the land of Israel or Palestine than have been fought for almost any other area in the world. And in the ancient world, the reason for this was that this very small rectangle, it's about 150 miles long and 70 miles wide. It's about the size of Rhode Island. This very small rectangle lies on the way to anywhere worth going in the ancient Near East. You've got Egypt over here, you've got Asia Minor up here, and you've got Mesopotamia over here. Not a tremendous amount of inherent value in this strip of land, but it's important for where you could go by traveling through it. So you have three main trade routes that cross the country, and they were used by trading caravans that would carry gold and grain and spices and textiles and other goods between Egypt and the rest of the Fertile Crescent up into Asia Minor. So control of these international highways brought a great deal of wealth to the area, but the central location was a double-edged sword. Because in times of peace, it would bring prosperity, but of course, in times of war, the land was perpetually invaded as armies would crisscross the land, going off to do battle with the great powers. So on their way to conquests in Egypt or Asia Minor or Mesopotamia, armies would tramp through the land. And that explains the succession of rulers that have held the region. The Egyptians, the Amorites, the Israelites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Greek Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Romans, and the list continues as we go on into the medieval and the modern periods. Now, despite the fact that this is a very small piece of land, it boasts great geographical diversity. So there are three main geographical subdivisions. You can see them on your map, and they really run in strips from north to south. If you look at your map, you'll see first on the west side, you've got a low coastal plain. It's about 20 or 30 miles wide. It's the coastal plain, and that provides that is the main highway out of Egypt or down to Egypt. That area was controlled by Egypt at the purported time of the Exodus. Running north to south next to that coastal plain is a region of low mountains. These low mountains are cut by some valleys that sort of run east-west. You'll see one there, the Valley of Jezreel in particular. That was a particularly fertile valley. So the valleys that cut through the mountains are extremely fertile. The plain of Megiddo also joins with the Valley of Jezreel. That's the most fertile part of the country, but it was also the site of many of the most bloody battles in Israel's history. Then next to that north-south central hill country, you've got also running north to south what we call the Great Jordan Rift Valley. It goes the entire length of the country. And the Jordan River runs through this valley. It rises in the Sea of Galilee or the Kinneret in the north, and then it flows about 65 miles, I believe, down to the Dead Sea. At the northern extreme of this rift, the Rift Valley, is Mount Hermon, which is the highest point. It's a snow-covered Mount Hermon, and that's the highest point in Israel. It rises about 10,000 feet above sea level. The central mountain area, those are between 4,000 and 10,000 feet above sea level. As you move from the central area over to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level. But then as you continue moving east towards the Rift Valley, that area is dramatically lower, and you feel it as you travel the road there, just how quickly it drops, so that by the time you get to the Sea of Galilee, you're 700 feet below sea level, and the Dead Sea is nearly 1,300 feet below sea level. That is the lowest point on the Earth's land surface. So it's a dramatic drop in just a very short geographical area. Up in the north, the river is surrounded by very lush vegetation on both sides, but there's no life 65 miles south down by the Dead Sea. This is because the water is 25% salts and minerals, although I hear they found some sort of bacteria or something there. So I guess I shouldn't say anymore that there's no life, but essentially there's no life we would care about in the Dead Sea area. So it's a very desolate area, and tradition identifies this as the site of Sodom and Gomorrah. The area around the sea is basically semi-desert. We call this the wilderness of Judea, between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, the wilderness of Judah or Judea. So within this relatively tiny area, there are radically diverse regions, and this fact held important implications for Israel's history. Unity was difficult. Being somewhat isolated, the inhabitants of each region developed a distinctive economic and cultural character. You have the small settled farmer in the more fertile areas. You have semi-nomadic shepherds. You have city dwellers. You have merchants and traders who are handling the commerce on the trade routes and enjoying broader cultural contacts. So that's the geographical setting for what we're about to read in the book of Joshua. The structure of Joshua is really somewhat simple. We can really divide it into two major parts. The first 12 chapters form a unit that convey the invasion and conquest. There are certain important elements. In chapter 2, we have Joshua sending out spies to scout out the land. In chapter 3, we have the account of crossing the Jordan River. In chapter 6, we have the Battle of Jericho. The story of the Battle of Jericho is really a composite of two accounts that have been woven together into a single narrative. So in one of them, Joshua's warriors seem to march silently around the city 7 times. In another, the priests carry the ark around the city 13 times. So the scholars think there are 2 different accounts here woven together. Chapter 8 describes a victory at a place called Ai, which is near Jericho. Chapter 9 tells the story of the Gibeonites who join the Israelites. They are a local group that seem to join them. And then 10 and 11 give us 2 further military campaigns. 11, towards the end of 11, we have summary statements. In Joshua 10, verse 40, we read, "So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country, and the Negev, that's the desert here to the south, and the lowland." So you have the hill country, the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings. He left no one remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed. Chapter 11 goes on to stress that Joshua completed the task that had been begun by Moses. In verse 15, "Just as the Lord had commanded his servant Moses, so Moses had charged Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses." And again in verse 23, the insistence, "Thus Joshua conquered the whole country, just as the Lord had promised Moses. And Joshua assigned it to Israel to share according to their tribal divisions, and the land had rest from war." So chapters 13 and 21 go on to describe the division of the land among the tribes, and then we have some sort of tidying up at the end. The remaining chapters are appendices. 23 is a farewell address, and 24 is a renewal of the covenant at Shechem, which brings everything to a nice conclusion. So the narrative in the first part of Joshua 2 to 12, describes the invading Israelites as an organized confederation of 12 tribes whose conquest is accomplished in a few decisive battles under the military leadership of Joshua. And the disunited Canaanites put up little or no resistance. They're paralyzed by a fear that's sent by God. All of those who were conquered are put to the ban, or the cherem. That's the sacred devotion of objects and persons to God, which entailed killing them. So they were utterly destroyed. So the first half of the book of Joshua contains a streamlined and idealized account, according to which the Israelites managed in a relatively short period to take the central hill country, confining the Philistines to a little strip of here on the coastal plain. We'll come to the Philistines in a minute. The account of the conquest in Joshua 2 through 12 is concerned to express the basic idea that Israel's victories would not have been possible without Yahweh, without his wondrous help. It was Yahweh who divided the Jordan before them. It was Yahweh who broke down the walls of Jericho. It was Yahweh who put fear in the hearts of the Canaanites. Yahweh was present at every battle. The ark was the visible sign of his presence, and it marched before them. And soon after the conquest, representatives of all of the tribes of Israel are going to meet and make a solemn covenant at Shechem to be the people of Yahweh, to worship him alone. And according to the book of Joshua, Israel's tribal structure assumed its classical form at this time. This is a very neat picture of the rapid conquest of Canaan, but it's at odds with statements elsewhere in Joshua and in the book of Judges. For example, the victories in chapters 2 through 10 are confined to a very small area, what would actually be the tribe of Benjamin, basically, so just one small area. In Joshua 13, verse 1, Joshua 13 opens with the statement that Joshua was old, advanced in years, and there was much of the land remaining to be possessed. In Joshua 10, which is in the first part of Joshua, right? So Joshua 10, verses 36 to 39 report the conquest of several cities in the south, including Hebron and Debir. But in Judges, we read that they hadn't been captured. They were captured later, after Joshua's death. Joshua 12, verse 10 reports the defeat of the king of Jerusalem. In Judges 1, verse 8 and 21, we read that the people of Judah did this, conquered the king of Jerusalem, and that despite that victory, they failed to actually drive out the inhabitants, the Jebusites, who lived there. And it's not until King David, 200 years later, that, in fact, we will read about the capture of Jerusalem. Judges 1 gives a long list of the places from which the Canaanites were not expelled. Also, archaeological evidence contradicts the picture in Joshua. In the ancient Near East, destroyed cities tended to be leveled, and then a new city would just be built on top of the ruins. And you would have these slowly rising mounds, and that each one of those is called a tell, right? So you may have heard of Tel Dor. These are mounds which represent the successive layers of destroyed and rebuilt cities. And excavations will reveal the destruction layers under the floor of new cities. So following the biblical account, we would expect evidence of a 13th century destruction of Canaanite cities. And archaeologists for a long time were convinced that they would find these destruction layers, but they were disappointed. They have found really no evidence of extensive conquest and destruction in 13th and 12th century archaeological layers. Some of the sites that are said to be destroyed by Joshua and the Israelites weren't even occupied in this period, the late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age, right? The Iron Age begins around 1200. So excavations at Jericho and Ai indicate that both of these towns were laid waste at least 200 years before the probable time of Joshua. So there weren't even any walls in Jericho at the time of Joshua. Of 20 identifiable sites that were said to be conquered or captured by Joshua and the next generations, only 2 show destruction layers for this time, Chatzor and Beit El. And yet, interestingly enough, Chatzor's capture, described in Joshua, is contradicted elsewhere in the Bible, because in Judges 4 and 5, it's still a Canaanite city. It's said there that it's still a Canaanite city, and Joshua failed to take it. So the conclusion one can draw from all of this is that Joshua 2 through 12 is a kind of ideological construction, the significance and the purpose of which we'll come back to in a moment. But clearly, the formation of a nation-state, Israel, was much more complicated than the picture that's presented in Joshua 2 through 12. Scholars have proposed 3 possible models to explain the formation of Israel. The first is an immigration model. This was first posed by German scholars. Since the main Canaanite cities that existed in the land at that time were fortified or walled cities down on the plains, the Israelites, it's thought, according to this model, would have entered and they would have occupied the very sparsely populated central highlands. They would slowly have begun to take control of the plains coming down from the highlands. Well, we do know that at the end of the late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age, around 1200, this was a time of great upheaval throughout the Mediterranean world. You have the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, you have the Trojan Wars, the Hittites are invading Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, to the north, and these upheavals are leading to mass migrations of people. Many are sailing from mainland Greece and from the Greek islands, and they are flooding this area, the coasts of Phoenicia, the coasts of Canaan, and Egypt. And these people are spoken about in a lot of our ancient sources. They're referred to as peoples of the sea, coming in from the sea, from islands and coastal areas of the northeastern Mediterranean. One of these peoples of the sea, one of these groups inhabited an area here. One of these groups, Parasta or Palasta, this is the word Palestine comes from this. Parasta, Palasta, or Philistines, it's all the same root. And so a group of these sea peoples comes in and occupies this area. They will be the Philistines, the area that is now the Gaza Strip. And they found the 5 Philistine cities that you'll hear about increasingly in the book of Judges: Gaza, Ashkelon, Gat, Ashdod, and Ekron. The idea of the immigration model is that Hebrew settlement would have probably occurred at about the same time, in the latter part of the 13th century. The Hebrews could take advantage of all of these upheavals and the weakened hold of Egypt, right? Remember, Egypt had control of this area, but their grasp is weakening with the flood of people coming in from the sea and other migrations. Their hold is weakening, and the Israelites would have, or the Hebrews would have been able to take advantage of that and enter in and occupy areas in the central highlands. The problem with the immigration model, again, is the archaeological record. Archaeologists have indeed found several sites in the central hill country, which is pretty exciting, and they're clearly newly established in the 13th, 12th, 11th centuries. So clearly something new was happening in the central highlands at this time. they extend throughout the land, but mostly the Central Highlands. And these are thought to be Israelite, especially because they appear in places that the Bible identifies as strongholds of Israel. So remember also, you have the Merneptah stele of 1204, in which the Egyptian pharaoh boasts that he managed to wipe out Israel. It's obviously a hyperbolic boast, but the point is, it shows that there was an identifiable entity, Israel, in Canaan by 1204. These new 13th century settlements, however, are in their material culture, that is to say their pots and their jars and their houses, entirely Canaanite. The inhabitants seem to have been peasant farmers like other Canaanites. One interesting difference is the absence of any pig bones, which is kind of interesting. But in any event, this suggests that these settlements were established peacefully, not by a group coming in and conquering. Maybe they emerged from within, rather than being established by peoples immigrating from without. So there are two other models then, models different from the immigration model, two other models for understanding the formation of Israel that build on this archaeological evidence. The second model is what we call the revolt model. The revolt model proposes that Israel began really as a social revolution within Canaan. We do have a set of letters. These are letters that date from the 14th century BCE. They were written by people in Canaan to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Remember, the Pharaoh still has control over Canaan at this time. And in these letters are lots of complaints about groups that are causing turmoil and upset in Canaan. They're challenging Egypt's rule. And these people are called Habiru or Abiru. They weren't an ethnic group so much as a marginal social group of people in revolt, if you will. Some have suggested that Israelites escaping from Egypt may have joined with these disaffected Canaanites in revolt, known as Abiru, these troublemakers, to establish their own settlements and to worship a liberator god, Yahweh, rather than follow the rule of Pharaoh. A final model, then, is a model of gradual emergence, which simply holds that Israelites were basically Canaanites who had developed a separate identity and settled increasingly in the Central Highlands. They withdrew and settled in this area. The theory doesn't try to explain why they separated. We don't know. Perhaps it was disaffection. Perhaps they were pushed out by the invading sea peoples. And maybe it was something else. But they withdrew for some reason. And how and why they took up the worship of Yahweh or the cult of Yahweh isn't really clear, but it seems to have been what marked them as distinct from other Canaanites. The Yahweh cult may have been introduced by people escaping slavery from Egypt. Most scholars see the Exodus story as evidence for the presence of some escaped slaves among this community. So the important thing is that the Hebrews at this stage were probably not a united people. Various elements went into the final mix that would emerge as the nation Israel. Local Canaanites who for some reason withdrew and established their own settlements with a continuous material culture and established agricultural lifestyle. You have them. You have escaping slaves from Egypt. And remember, we do have some evidence of destruction from outside, so there could also have been some foreigners coming in and destroying and settling. It even seems that some local foreigners were admitted to the community. We read of Midianites who covenant into the community. We read of Kenites who covenant into the community. And archaeology supports this picture of merging of peoples, a picture of the merging of peoples, rather than conquest or even large-scale immigration, because the new settlements in this period show such continuity with the past, not a complete break, not the initiation of something radically new. And again, some of the elements within this group may have brought with them the story of a miraculous escape from Egypt. They may have understood this to be the work of Yahweh, a god known probably from southern regions. And so the mixed group that would join together to become Israel accepted Yahweh, though perhaps not exclusively, and adopted the national story of the Exodus as its own at some point. The Hebrew tribes themselves were likely still in the process of formation, but the tribal structure of Israelite society that would develop would be strengthened by the natural division of the land into these separate geographical areas. That only reinforced the tribalization of society. And these local tribes probably did assimilate elements of the local population. We've really seen already the ethnic mix of various elements reflected in religious imagery and institutions. We've seen that Yahweh is represented in terms reminiscent of the tent dweller, El, the god of the semi-nomadic tent-dwelling Hebrews and their patriarchs, and certainly a god of the Canaanite pantheon. We've seen that Yahweh is also represented in terms reminiscent of Baal of the Canaanite pantheon, the god of the settled Canaanite population. In fact, in the book of Judges, you will read of a temple to Israel's God, the God of the covenant, and that temple is called the temple to the God of the covenant, or Baal Berit. The word Berit means covenant. It's referred to as Baal Berit, it's referred to as El Berit, or Baal El Berit. And this is in reference to Yahweh. These terms are all used to describe the God of the covenant. So, in short, we really may hypothesize a union of cultural, religious, and ethnic elements. Local Canaanite agriculturalists, semi-nomadic Hebrews, perhaps, of the Exodus, escaped slaves, perhaps Hapiru, Apiru, a disaffected or group that's in revolt. All of these would come together to produce what would be a new political and religious reality called Israel. If so, why does the book of Joshua provide such a different account? One of outside conquest by means of a war led by the hosts of the Lord. Because in this account, military skill is much less important than ritual preparation and purity. Right? The Israelites march around Jericho for 6 days with 7 priests carrying 7 horns and the Ark of the Covenant. And then with a blast and a shout, the walls tumble. The conquest is represented as a miraculous victory by God. That's emphasized in Joshua 24:12. It was God, not the sword or the bow, that drove out the enemy. And why the claim of the utter destruction of the Canaanites when evidence points to close Canaanite origins? This practice, which I mentioned before, is known as cherem, or the ban, is not unique to Israel. I know some of you have studied it in sections. You looked at the inscription of King Mesha of Moab. There's a very important, famous inscription from the 9th century BCE, written by King Mesha of Moab. Moab is to the southeast. No, so I'm bad with directions. Southwest. Yeah, that's east. Yeah. So kind of to the east, southeast of the Dead Sea. So King Mesha of Moab. And in the inscription he writes, he boasts, "And the god Chemosh said to me, 'Go, take Nebo from Israel.' So I went by night and fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, taking it and slaying all 7,000 men, boys, women, and girls, and maidservants, for I had devoted them to destruction for the god Ashtar Chemosh," referring to cherem. It's likely that such claims are hyperbolic in Moab, and it's likely they were hyperbolic in Israel. But that doesn't lessen the shock value for a modern reader, even though war in our time is no less savage and no less brutal. But the important question here is why a biblical writer or editor would want to insist that the Canaanites were to be completely destroyed. I think assertions of national identity and independence are often predicated on differentiation from others. If the Israelites were in fact basically Canaanites who had withdrawn from the larger collective, who insisted on the overlordship of Yahweh, then Canaanites who did not join them in this were a special threat to the new Yahwism. This same dynamic of intense sibling rivalry appears again in the first few centuries of the Common Era, when some Jews separated from others and in differentiating themselves and creating their own identity as Christians, felt it necessary to engage in devastatingly vituperative and violent rhetoric against their fellow Jews. The interesting thing, however, is that we mustn't ignore another voice that's in the biblical text, and it's a voice that adds a level of complexity to this picture. Because alongside the idealized portrayal of the Israelite conquest in the first half of the book of Joshua, alongside the call for the destruction of all Canaanites, we find interesting tales of alliances and incorporation of various Canaanite groups. Indeed, who is one of the heroines of the Battle of Jericho, if not a Canaanite woman, a prostitute no less, named Rachav? She declares her faith in Yahweh and she delivers the city into Joshua's hands. The biblical writer saw fit to preserve and include this account of a heroic Canaanite prostitute. Another Canaanite group, the Gibeonites, tricked the Israelites into making a covenant with them, and it's a covenant the Israelites then feel bound to observe. Michael Coogan has described such stories as etiological tales. They are attempts to explain the fact that there are lots of Canaanite groups included in Israel, and we need to understand and explain that reality as much as we are conveying an ideological account in which all Canaanites are obliterated or destroyed. At the very least, these stories raise questions about the biblical portrait or portrayal of invasion and conquest, and at most, they illustrate the biblical writer's taste for literary subversion yet again, something we'll see over and over. The imperative of preserving a distinct identity that's based on giving up the worship of other gods or older gods and observing all that is written in the law of Moses is reiterated in Joshua's farewell address in Joshua 23 and in the covenant renewal ceremony in 24. And the central idea is that there is one proper response to God's mighty acts on behalf of Israel, and that is resolute observance of the book of the Torah of Moses without intermingling with the peoples that remain. So in Joshua 23, verses 7 and 8, do not utter the names of their gods or swear by them. Do not serve them or bow down to them, but hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done this day. And verses 11 to 13, for your own sakes, therefore, be most mindful to love the Lord your God, for should you turn away and attach yourselves to the remnant of these nations, to those that are left among you, and intermarry with them, you joining them and they joining you, know for certain that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out before you. They shall become a snare and a trap for you, a scourge to your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land that the Lord your God has given you. In 24, the Israelites are assembled at Shechem to renew the covenant, and Joshua recounts God's mighty deeds on behalf of Israel and exhorts them to choose whom they will serve, Yahweh, who's done all of this for them so undeservedly, or the gods of those whose lands they are settling in. And the people are warned of God's jealousy. He demands exclusive loyalty. He will not tolerate any deviation in service of alien gods. The ban on intermarriage here is quite specific. It's directed against Canaanites only, not all non-Israelites, for a very specific reason: religious purity. Marriage with Canaanites, the people closest to you, specifically, will lead to the worship of that spouse's God, and Israel is to show undivided loyalty to God, or God will take the gift of the land from her as he did the Canaanites. One last remark for you to think about. Consider the position of the Israelites in the 6th century, the time of the final editing of the Deuteronomistic history. The Israelites are sitting in exile in Babylon. They're trying to make sense of the tragedy that has befallen them, the loss of their land. Consider how a text like Joshua 23 and Joshua 24 would go a long way towards explaining their fate while retaining faith in Yahweh.